Yeah, I might not say that actually. It sounds terrible. I probably won't actually say that. I'll put a little.
All right, I think we're going to start. Your Energy Future Fellows, Action Canada alumni, honored guests, good morning and thank you for joining us here today for the final presentation of your Energy Future Fellowship Program. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. The Public Policy Forum recognizes the historical claim of these original inhabitants and is committed to working in solidarity with Indigenous people towards a goal of reconciliation and decolonization. My name is Anna Jan. I'm the Director of Membership and Partnerships with the Public Policy Forum. And on behalf of the President, Ed Greenspan, I'm delighted to welcome you here today. Ed had every intention of being here, but unfortunately, personal obligations got in the way of that, so he's out of town. He sends his best wishes to the Action Canada Fellows, and his sincere thanks to the friends and partners here today. Your Energy Future is a national policy engagement and leadership development program. The PPF has designed and delivered this program in partnership with Action Canada, but we could not have done so without the very generous support of our sponsors. The Government of Canada, the Lawson Foundation, WestJet, McCarthy Tetro, and EY. We are also very appreciative of the support of the Friends of the Your Energy Future program, Synovus, Hydro-Quebec, the Energy Future Lab, Kruger Energy Incorporated, the University of Toronto, the Government of Alberta, and Ontario Power Generation. On behalf of the Public Policy Forum, and especially this year's Action Canada cohort, thank you so very much for supporting Your Energy Future. I also want to give a quick shout out to the PPF team that delivered this program because they worked very hard over the past year. So thanks especially to Project Administrator Catherine Cherky, to Policy Lead Rhonda Moore, Communication Specialist Jonathan Perrault-Clos, and Nosheen Ahmed. They made these beautiful brochures that you have in front of you. And another special thanks to the Director of Policy, Lindsay Martins. Finally, on behalf of the Public Policy Forum, thank you to the Action Canada YEF Fellows. We actually affectionately called you the Yeffers in our office over the past years. Before I introduce our next speaker, I have a few comments and housekeeping items. So today we're also joined by an online audience. This event is being live streamed through the PPF YouTube channel. For those who are joining online, please send us your questions using Slido. Visit slido.com and enter the code K545. Again, slido.com, and the code is K545. You can post questions and vote for others. We have a PPF staff person, actually Jonathan is going to manage that, here who's monitoring the online discussion. He will relay questions from Slido to presenters in the room. There is a PPF person on site who's monitoring the online questions. Oh, well, we talked about that. And then for everyone who's in the room, if you would like to ask a question during the Q&A portion of the event, I'll just invite you to line up at the two mics that we have here in the room, and so that actually the online participants can hear you clearly. We are also live tweeting this event through the Your Energy Future account. It is now my pleasure to invite Marcel Lauzière to offer words of welcome. Marcel is the President and CEO of the Lawson Foundation and a member of the Board of Directors of the Public Policy Forum.
Merci, Anna. Good morning, bienvenue à tous et toutes. In my capacity as member of the board of the Public Policy Forum, I want to welcome you all and repeat what Anna said, that Ed was really hoping to be here, but something came up and he is not able to be here, but he does send his best to everyone. But I'm truly delighted to be here to welcome you. Le Forum des politiques publiques est vraiment heureux de collaborer avec Action Canada pour le programme Votre avenir énergétique. Les deux organisations sont vraiment très alignées dans le sens que le but, je pense, des deux organisations, c'est de créer des conversations, créer une capacité d'engagement civique et d'amener les gens autour de la table de tous les secteurs, finalement des intervenants de tous les secteurs pour s'intéresser au renforcement des politiques publiques. Alors, il y a vraiment, je pense, un alignement là très, très intéressant. And I think the event really, well, you would know, the Yeffers. I didn't know they were called the Yeffers. The combination of almost 2 years of really hard work between the Forum and Action Canada. And it was really through the vision, I think, of Adam Goldenberg and Richard Discerny and Jay Kosla and Neil Bauer, who can't be here today, that this partnership actually took place and happened. And from my understanding, Adam, as the chair of the board of directors of Action Canada, it's really your dedication and those, I'm sure, of your colleagues on the board that made this program come to life. And you're the one who really looked at, finding a viable partnership to ensure that the program would continue, and that's where the partnership with the Public Policy Forum came together. And I think that's where Richard Discerny came on board. Not came on board, in fact, I think my understanding is Richard really is the one that brought the two organizations together. Richard had been very involved with Action Canada, very involved with the Public Policy Forum. I think, Richard, you were leaving the board when I was actually arriving on the board, so we didn't get to work together, but your reputation is still there very much at the board of the Forum. Et Richard, tu es ici, toi, en tant que président du comité aviseur de votre avenir énergétique. Et c'est vraiment toi qui as fait finalement le lien entre les deux organisations. Ta grande connaissance, évidemment, des rouages politiques, ta sagesse, ton expérience, tout le reste, je pense que c'était très important pour la cohorte. Looking at the efforts, I would think that Richard has been a strong influence for the work that you have been doing over the last 2 years. Jay Kosla and Neil Bauer, who unfortunately can't make it here this year, but they were also key players here. It was, I think, a year and a half ago, the Public Policy Forum first approached Neil and Jay in their respective capacities at NRCan to support this version of Action Canada Fellowship. At that time, the department, I think, was in the early stages of developing Generation Energy, an initiative by Minister Carr to engage Canadians in a conversation about our collective energy future. And my understanding is that the minister was really keen on ensuring that the voice of young Canadians were part of that discussion. So the community engagement component of the program aligned really well with Generation Energy. So I think Jay and Neil at that point decided, this makes sense, let's support this. And that made a real difference, because it made a difference for the Public Policy Forum, because it allowed it to then turn to the Department of Environment and Climate Change, Heritage Canada for support, and then also the Lawson Foundation, which I happened to head, also got involved in terms of funding the initiative. It was important for the Lawson Foundation because we had actually just launched, about at that time, a new program around youth and the environment, recognizing the importance of connecting youth and the environment, and particularly recognizing the importance of voice of youth and the creativity and the different way of thinking, that if we're going to address our environmental issues going forward, there's no way that we can do that without youth playing a very strong leadership role. So the broad support for the program that Anna talked about, I think, underscores the importance, the timeliness of this initiative. The whole idea, of course, of ensuring affordable, clean energy for Canada is key. It's key to our communities, key to our cities, keys to our trade organizations, et cetera, around the world and here in Canada. I think there's a lot of possibility. And my sense from the work of the Yeffers is there's a lot of optimism that this can actually happen. Which brings me, I think, to the group of fellows who will be presenting to us in just a few minutes. So Canada's energy future is really your future, but I don't need to tell you that. You know that better than anyone else. You're all very young in your careers, you know, starting off your careers, maybe starting families, maybe starting to look at buying a home, etc. So you're at a particularly important time of your life where you, I think, are thinking about these kinds of things. And I don't think you're thinking about this as a simple concept or as a very vague concept. You really see this, I think, as something that can actually change the world. And you're absolutely well positioned to be able to do this and tackle what we often look at as a wicked public policy problem. So today marks the culmination of your fellowship, all the work that you've done over the last 2 years, invested in this fellowship has brought you here today. So I think I look forward, I'm sure everyone looks forward, everyone here and everyone online looks forward to your presentations and to your recommendations. So congratulations to all of you. Good luck going forward. And I would just like at the end to add my words to what Anna said and thank the whole public policy forum team under the leadership of Rhonda for making this happen. So looking forward to this. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Marcel. I would now like to invite Wayne Waters, partner at McCarthy Tétrault, to address your Energy Future Fellows.
That was a long introduction. Well, hello everyone. Bonjour à tous. It's great to see such a good mixture of wisdom as represented by this panel and youth as represented by all of you who've participated in this particular initiative over the last couple of years. First, we've been at McCarthy Tétrault very pleased to sponsor this initiative. I think it's tremendous. It's tremendous for a whole number of reasons. One is you're dealing with a very topical, very important issue for Canada and for the world as we try and move to a lower carbon environment. But I think the other thing that is equally important is that it brings together Canadians from all different walks of life, young Canadians at this point in your career, critical part of your career, to come together to share perspectives and views, different backgrounds from different parts of the country. And I think you will find that these relationships that you have now made will probably stay with you for the rest of your lives. You've been able to get a perspective of Canada, I would hope, in a very different way, and I think that's a huge value. You know, I spent my whole career in the public service of Canada, and I'm now so-called in the private sector. And one thing I have to say, my short time in the private sector, where I think Canada has, in some ways, where we have missed the boat and where we need to improve considerably, is that what surprises me sometimes is how little the private sector knows about government. And I think it's true in some cases about government and the private sector. And here you have an opportunity dealing with these significant public policy issues to have private sector and government at this point in your career come together, because this country is as strong as all the knowledge that we can bring to it from the private, public, volunteer sectors working together. So, great public policy issue. It's something that, for me, as a policy wonk, I wish I could be doing that with you. Though I just don't quite meet the age core. But, you know, I have to make a confession. I started my career in energy with the government of Saskatchewan, and then came to Ottawa and spent 9 years in the energy department here. And I was a huge proponent of expanding fossil fuel production. I was the lead negotiator on the Hibernia oil project. I basically negotiated an oil sands project. I negotiated the construction of the Husky oil upgrader so that we could produce more fossil fuels to not only supply Canada domestically, but also to export, in this case, to the United States. And, you know, through that, you know, I felt strongly that oil and gas development was a critical part of the Canadian economy, and I still feel that's the case. That's the case today. And so, how is it that a country like Canada, which we've become very dependent on fossil fuel, we're large consumers, we're large producers, how do we find that balance as we move to a lower carbon economy? And that is a huge challenge for Canada. I don't know if you ever read part of your work, read some of the studies by Michael Porter out of Harvard, who is you know, he's a very strong proponent to say that we need to move to low carbon. But he said after all these years in the United States where we lost our comparative advantage, suddenly we found it about 5 to 6, 7 years ago with shale gas and shale oil. We found very low cost energy again, and his kind of thesis is, are we throwing that out tomorrow as we try and move to a low carbon economy? So finding that balance, I haven't read all your studies. I'm interested in doing so, but that is a huge challenge for Canada. But I hope you found the experience a good one. I have to say, if you're interested in difficult, challenging, messy public policy issues, I know a place that all of you could come and work. It's right here in Ottawa. I know there's a couple of your colleagues are actually with the Federal Public Service, but there's no life like it. I have to say that after 38 years of working in the public service and worked in many, many different departments and with all of these colleagues here. Great issues to deal with. So if you liked what you were doing, come and talk to those people or talk to me. We could use more Canadians like you. Congratulations to the Public Policy Forum. Congratulations to Action Canada. This is just exactly the right thing to do. We need to do more of this. We need to get more Canadians together like this to deal with these issues. And you're contributing. I'm sure this work will find its way at provincial governments, federal governments, and into the public policy domain. So well done, everybody. And I'm sure today, as these reports come out, it's going to be interesting to see basically the conclusions that come out of all this. So thanks a lot, everybody, for the work you've done.
Thank you, Wayne. That's lovely. Good morning, everyone. My name is Rhonda Moore. I'm a policy lead with the Public Policy Forum and quite honored, actually, to be part of the team that delivered this program. I have 5 things to tell you about this morning. As a little inside joke for the Yeffers, because we have had the pleasure of counsel from Brian Topp all year, and he's always drilled into them, but I've benefited from a lot of these sessions, that you must organize your speaking remarks in 3 buckets. Well, I've got 5. But 2 are very small. And the first one is that we do have simultaneous interpretation in the room. There are headsets at the back of the room, and one of the presentations in particular will be largely in French. So I do invite you to make use of the headsets so you can follow along. And for the folks who are watching live stream online, unfortunately we can't extend that service to you online, so good luck. The second thing I want to tell you is a bit about the format. So after I'm done, the first task force will come up and deliver their presentation. We have a panel seated here at the front, a combination of advisors to the program and mentors who will respond to their presentation first with some comments and some questions, and then we'll open up the floor to Q&A from the audience. When we get to that stage, I invite you to, as Anna said, find one of the microphones on the floor, identify yourself, and ask your question. And now my last 3 things. So I'd like to tell you a bit about how we selected the participants of this program, because I think that's important to important context for the presentations they're delivering to you this morning. I'd like to talk to you about the breadth of the program they've completed. For the last couple of weeks, it probably feels like it was all about these reports, but there was a whole other portion of leadership training and education that we offered to them that I think is important context. And I certainly couldn't leave the stage without telling you about the tremendous caliber of leadership with which we surrounded them. So, in January 2016, we launched a national call for applications, leveraging the networks of the Public Policy Forum and Action Canada. We received 137 applications from Canadians across the country who wanted to participate in this program. 18 volunteers, a mix of PPF staff, Action Canada alumni, and mentors and advisors past and present to the program, worked over a period of 2 months, and we narrowed that group of 137 down to 16. We invited all 16 to join the program, and they accepted. And here they are. This is day 3 in Calgary of the first study tour. At the outset of this program, the Public Policy Forum defined success in 2 ways. We thought, first, that we wanted to bring together a group of Canadians that reflected the diversity of the country, that they would come from different parts of the country, that they would have different experiences, that they would have different political positions. And I think that we succeeded. They come from 5 provinces, very different backgrounds of education, of life experience, of big cities and small towns, and I think they run the gamut of political ideology and policy ideology. And the second goal for us was that we would be able to bring them together, that they could work together and develop a final project and present it to you. So today will be the test of whether we succeeded, I think, on that second goal. And so who helped us do that? Well, we surrounded this group with a team of 9 very accomplished senior leaders, an advisory council of 6 people, and a mentor for each of the 3 task forces. And I have to say that this group of 9 gave extremely freely of their time, their knowledge, to educate this group about policy, governance, leadership, history, energy, politics, and the intersections of energy and reconciliation. Our advisory council, chaired by Richard Discerny. So all 9 of these individuals are incredibly accomplished. I'm going to tell you like one tiny little thing that each of them have done. Otherwise, we would be here all day. So our advisory council, chaired by Richard Discerny, recently retired as the Deputy Minister of the Alberta Executive Council and head of the Alberta Public Service, also included Jody White, a senior fellow at the Massey College in Toronto and chair of the Board of Tides Canada, Pierre-Olivier Pinault, a professor in the Department of Decision Sciences of HEC Montréal and chair in Energy Sector Management, Chris Henderson, Loomis Energy and the Delphi Group, is also program designer and lead mentor of the Indigenous Clean Energy 2020 Catalyst Program and chair of the Globe series of conferences and exhibitions. Cheryl Cardinal, who until 2 weeks ago was president and CEO of the Indigenous Centre of Energy, is now accepted a position as the Director of Reconciliation and Indigenous Relations for Natural Resources Canada. And Rick Nielsen, the CEO of Air North and a former Action Canada Fellow. And we also had 3 mentors for the program. Carol Swan, former president of the Canadian Food Inspection Agency and Associate Deputy Minister at Industry Canada. André Junot, fellow of the Queen's University Institute of Intergovernmental Relations and chair of the Windsor-Detroit Bridge Authority. And Brian Topp, political strategist, writer, former union leader, and chief of staff to Alberta Premier Rachel Notley. So to all 9 of these individuals, I say a very hearty thank you on behalf of the fellows and the PPF staff. They spent a lot of time with us on all of the study tours and on the phone and in lots of meetings. So thank you very much. And it was certainly with their support and leadership that we developed a robust program. We delivered this program in the form of 4 study tours, a collection of readings, and a webinar series. The study tours were delivered in Alberta, Quebec, Manitoba, and Ontario between June 2017 and January 2018. Each study tour lasted between 5 and 7 days, and they were full days, sometimes 16 hours. And certainly it would take me all morning to walk you through the various modules of that program. So I will just focus on some of the highlights. The curriculum was designed in 3 tracks. There was a leadership development track, a public policy track, and an energy track. In the leadership track, the group learned about things like team building and dynamics, how to write an op-ed. They participated in some media relations training, including on-camera time, and had very, very deep, I think, and raw conversations about things like mental health, ethics, and work-life balance. This module included a walking tour of Regent Park in Toronto and candid discussions with leaders like Janet Ansley, Ian Bird, Rand Sharma, Aaron Spink, and Mel Kapp. In this track, fellows learned about themselves, their strengths, and the kind of leaders they want to become. The public policy module included sessions that explore how the federal government works, the art and science of negotiation, Indigenous and European governance systems, and interprovincial negotiation and cooperation. It included a guided tour of the Canadian Parliament and the Supreme Court of Canada, and a blanket exercise with Cree elders. Through this module, the fellows met and learned from people like Diane Gray, David McLaughlin, Jim Eldridge, Sunil Yohal, and Justice Malcolm Rowe. In the energy module, fellows learned about Canada's energy mix and supply, infrastructure, and provincial policies and priorities related to energy and regulatory models. This module included a tour of the oil sands, which is where this photograph was taken, a visit to the Kruger Wind Farm in Saint-Rémy, Quebec, a visit to the Robert Bourassa substation and La Grande in Radisson, Quebec, a visit to the trading floor of Hydro-Quebec and the OPG mock nuclear reactor in Darlington. We also had some fun. As you can see here, this was our last day in Calgary. We went to the Telespark Center. We had a few hours to kill before the plane. And this is us at the wind farm in Saint-Rémy. So through the energy module, they met with people like Joanne Gelina, former Grand Chief Matthew Kuhn-Combe, Jean Charest, Alana Lajoie O'Malley, Tom Ackerstream, Ted Grutzner, Jason Cameron, Kim Blanchette, and many more. The curriculum provided fellows with a common foundation of information, and it's with this foundation that they undertook to answer 2 questions we posed to them during the first study tour. What do they want Canada's energy future to look like in 2050, and how do they want to get there? And the answers to these questions are in fact the subject of their task force papers. In parallel with these study tours, each group designed a community engagement activity that targeted Canadians between the ages of 18 and 35. The task forces used this original research to complement the learnings from the program and inform the recommendations they'll present to you today. Their reports reflect 3 distinct challenges facing Canada: the energy needs of rural and remote Canadians, the changing job market, and personal transportation. So at the end of all of this, and this is us in Toronto at the GM-CTC Centre, where there's really interesting research going on about the information systems in the vehicles that we drive. So at the beginning of my talk, I talked about 2 goals. One, to bring a diverse group together, and a second goal, to help them work together. So have we succeeded? Well, throughout the course of the program, we asked a number of them often what their favorite part of the program was. And here is their response. Can you roll the video?
So what I've enjoyed most about the project so far, it's hard to single out one thing, but I would say the people involved, the participants, the other fellows, quite a diverse range of perspectives, and the people that come to give us presentations and workshops and just share their experiences. So it's definitely the people that I think is the highlight that stands out to me.
Well, I think what I've enjoyed most about the program is the collaboration between people from across the country. And I never had the opportunity to travel across my own country, but the realization of the viewpoints and the differences across the Federation have really given me a lot of perspective on my own perspective, but then also realizing the potential and ideas of others.
Ce qui me motive le plus dans le cadre de ce projet, c'est vraiment d'être en mesure de travailler sur un projet de politique publique avec des gens compétents de partout à travers le pays, d'être capable de faire aller nos neurones, de pouvoir travailler ensemble, faire un remue-ménage, être en mesure d'arriver avec un produit original qui va être en mesure d'avoir un impact sur les politiques publiques canadiennes.
All 16 fellows have very different backgrounds and come from really, different areas within Canada, and we've still found ways to all collaborate and listen and understand each other, and I think that that's really unique.
Well, I think for me, the interaction with the other participant is really an integral part of the program, because we have people from all walks of life in different regions, and I've learned as much from the other participant as I did from some speakers, which were great, but also sharing these experiences with a very diverse group of people was very enriching for me, and learning from my co-participant was a great part of this experience, and a very surprising aspect of the program as well.
Thank you. So I now invite the members of Task Force 1 to the stage to deliver their presentation. Diane Adams, James Clark, Lindsay Colley, Bruno Fauché, and Alexandria Shrake.
Bon matin tout le monde. Et tout d'abord, merci beaucoup d'être présent aujourd'hui pour venir écouter la présentation de notre rapport qui s'intitule « Où il fait bon vivre, soutenir des économies propres pour les collectivités rurales et autochtones ». Je me présente, Bruno Fauché, je suis avocat de formation, mais j'étudie présentement le droit international au Royaume-Uni. Et j'en profite également pour vous présenter notre équipe qui est, comme on l'a dit, et comme vous l'avez vu dans la vidéo, fort diverse et qui vient d'horizons fort divers. Tout d'abord, à l'extrémité de la table, Lindsay Colley, qui est une comptable agréée de formation et qui travaille dans le domaine de la responsabilité sociale des entreprises, basée à Toronto. À sa droite, Alexandria Shrake, qui est basée à Calgary, qui est une géophysicienne et qui travaille pour une compagnie pétrolière, justement, à Calgary. Et James Clark, un de nos fonctionnaires, comme on disait, on en a quelques-uns, qui travaille pour Affaires mondiales, ici même à Ottawa, dans le domaine du financement de projets reliés au changement climatique. Et finalement, tout de suite à ma gauche, Diane Adams, qui est une spécialiste de la santé publique et également du développement économique des communautés autochtones. C'est d'ailleurs Diane qui va débuter la présentation et je lui cède immédiatement la parole. Merci.
Thank you, everyone. I'm so glad you could all be here, and I'd just like to recognize that we are on the traditional territory of the Algonquin peoples today, and quite happy to be here. So today we're going to take you through our project from idea to action, but first I'd like to share a little bit about two communities. Now, these communities, today they are very different, and they may have a different history, but they have a shared vision for the future. So first, we have Hinton, Alberta. Now, Hinton, Alberta is a community of 10,000 people in the Alberta Rocky Mountains. Its residents are heavily employed in oil and in gas and in coal. And to diversify their economy, their energy mix, and reduce their heating costs, Hinton is developing a geothermal heating district. This low-carbon project would use existing oil and gas infrastructure to provide government and commercial buildings with low-cost geothermal heat. Hinton says their greatest challenge was navigating a complex government funding system that they say did not recognize geothermal along with other renewables like wind and solar. Now, after many years of working with the University of Alberta and outside business experts, they were able to secure federal funding for their project this year. If we head 1,200 kilometers east to Saskatchewan, we will find the Cowessess First Nation. Now, this community in the Qu'Appelle Valley has 800 on-reserve members and over 3,000 off-reserve members who live all across the country. Now, Cowessess is led by a young and ambitious chief, and they are seeking long-term wealth creation through community-owned assets. Now, renewable energy is one of their largest investments, and their signature project is a windmill and battery storage project in nearby Regina. And that battery technology is one of a kind in Canada. Now, they say their biggest challenge has been moving forward in accessing capital to scale up that project and ensuring their community members have the education and the skills to lead these projects in the years to come. Now, communities like Hinton and Cowessess are very different in their history, their culture, and in their economic situation, but they share one thing in common: a vision for a low-carbon energy future. It was stories like theirs that inspired the vision for this project and drove us to look at clean economies for rural and Indigenous communities. We share a vision for a low-carbon future that is prosperous for all, a vision where Canada's rural and Indigenous communities are vibrant places to live and to work. Their integrated economies thrive in nation-to-nation partnerships. They are friends in low-carbon places. And when we started this process, we knew the future of Canada's rural and Indigenous communities was important to all of us. But recent events in Western Canada are truly showing us why we need a path forward. The recent Colton Boushie case has really exposed how badly we need a new relationship where rural and Indigenous communities meet, and we believe that low-carbon development can light the way. This future really matters to all of us, and I'd like to just take a look at some of the impact. So more than half of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions are attributed to rural industries and rural lifestyles. 30% of Canadians live in communities under 30,000 people, and for Indigenous people, 60% are living outside urban areas. Estimates say that the Canadian economy would grow by $27 billion if we close the economic gap between Indigenous people and the rest of Canada. If we look at our current economic picture, 60% of our entire export economy relies on natural resources that are developed in rural regions. This includes food, forest products, oil and gas, and minerals. People around the world rely on these resources for food, for infrastructure, and the things they use every single day. But rural communities also use more fossil fuels for transportation and for heating. And so these communities may be hard hit by a low-carbon energy transition, especially if the price of fossil fuels suddenly rises. So this project really asks, what does a low-carbon future really mean for these communities, and what is their path forward? So our project had 3 objectives. 1, to identify the key policy priorities and strategies for low-carbon economic development in rural and Indigenous communities. 2, to identify the priorities and values that are important to young people. Energy policy decisions have long-term impact, and the voice of young people must be included in those conversations. 3rd, and this may be why some of you are here today, is to identify the federal government frameworks and policies that can take us forward on that long-term vision today. So here's just a little look at the research process that we went through with this project. So first, we undertook an environmental scan to look at the current policy environment, federal funds that already exist, and existing projects. Now, some of this work happened as traditional desk work, traditional desk research, but much of it happened in person through our study tours, through the people we met, and the things that we learned in the conferences we attended. Second, we did 4 types of primary research. First, We did the Powerful Changes Youth Survey, which was a survey that asked young people in their communities, everyday young people, about their energy future, and we targeted them through Facebook advertisements. We did 2 online roundtables with young leaders in rural and Indigenous economic development. We did 2 case studies where we engaged with communities who were in the midst of decarbonizing their economies. And we also did interviews with established experts in energy policy and low carbon projects. Once this work was complete, we worked together collaboratively from across the country to come up with our policy themes and our policy recommendations. And we'll share a bit more about those later in the presentation. But first, I'd like to share with you some of the things that we heard when we engaged with stakeholders, especially young stakeholders, through this primary research project. So first, jobs and opportunities are a #1 priority for young people. And in order to be resilient and support that priority, communities must be able to keep up with rapid technological change. Next, there's no consensus on the future of oil and gas in Canada's economy. The survey respondents from our survey said that oil and gas will be as important or less important for the future of Canada, while the experts we engaged were clear that we will produce fossil fuels for decades to come. But we heard clearly that social and environmental sustainability are important considerations for all policymaking going forward. Throughout this presentation, we will also share with you what stakeholders told us in their own words. So some ideas and principles came up again and again through these engagement activities. We heard them from multiple sources, we heard them in multiple contexts, that this is how to make policy work for rural and Indigenous communities.
Ken Coates is a professor of public policy at the University of Saskatchewan. He says, Canada desperately needs to re-engage with rural Canada and create policy that is actually supportive of local needs.
We call these ideas our guiding principles, and they became criteria that we used in our policy analysis. So these guiding principles are, first, self-determination. We heard from rural and Indigenous communities that they take enormous pride in their communities and in their cultures, and we heard that their path to self-sufficiency lies in robust economic development. Second, we heard that a successful low-carbon energy transition will require extensive collaboration between jurisdictions. While energy and economic decisions are often made at the federal or at the provincial level, they have enormous implications for Indigenous governments and municipalities, and all levels of government must work together. Third is reconciliation. Any path forward must focus on renewed relationships between rural and Indigenous people and communities. It must help close unacceptable economic and social gaps and respect Indigenous rights. Now I'd like to invite James Clark to the podium to tell you about our policy recommendations.
Thanks, Diane. Based on these guiding principles, we developed 10 recommendations divided across 4 themes. But before I go into these recommendations, I'd like to briefly discuss my experience. Historically, federal policymaking has had a very Ottawa-centric approach and has not sufficiently considered the lived experiences of the people affected by it. When I started this project in June, I had little experience in community engagement and consultation. But through the project, I heard firsthand practical advice from communities on how to include their perspectives in policymaking. This was a really valuable experience for me as a young public servant in the early stages of my career. Let's talk about our first theme, which is in how to engage rural and Indigenous communities in the policy process. Policies need to be sensitive to local needs, culture, and priorities. We heard that communities want to participate actively in developing the policies that will affect them.
Lors des tables rondes que nous avons tenues avec les règles de la Chatham House, l'un de nos panélistes nous a dit « Faites appel à nous, laissez-nous participer, laissez-nous élaborer ces politiques. Nos possibilités à long terme pourraient ainsi être élargies. »
Our first recommendation is to ensure that policies can be applied to diverse community contexts. Governments should avoid being overly prescriptive. They should use a place-based approach to policymaking and build this capacity in communities as well. Second, policymaking should be grounded in communities' lived experience. We consistently heard that communities felt that policymakers in Ottawa and in provincial or territorial capitals did not adequately integrate real-life experience into their decision-making. This can be corrected by having community members fully participate in the policy development process, including through secondments or staff exchange programs. Our second theme relates to community energy planning. Clean and affordable energy is a key component of a healthy, vibrant community.
An excerpt from the 2017 Pan-Canadian Summit on Reducing Diesel in Remote Communities. Participants really focused in on the need for community energy plans that are developed with communities directly to support community building, economic development, and ownership.
We recommend that the Government of Canada provide direct financial support for community-led energy planning. This would ground energy within a community's wider development objectives and identify how specific energy projects can achieve these goals. Second, we recommend that the Government of Canada improve its approach to data collection and sharing and use this data to inform its policymaking. Our research shows that rural and Indigenous communities will likely be disproportionately affected by the low-carbon energy transition. However, significant data gaps exist in understanding the way that the transition will affect these communities. Government should be cautious and extensively consult communities on the probable impacts of these policies. Better data will inform effective policymaking. We live in a time of rapid technological change and economic disruption. Our third set of recommendations are about empowering rural and Indigenous communities to thrive in a low-carbon energy transition.
As one of our roundtable panelists told us, we are working hard to be very competitive, and government needs to recognize that. We are not here asking for a handout. We are here to participate and compete in the economy.
To enable communities to thrive in this uncertain future, we have three recommendations. Governments should support entrepreneurship, including through changes in procurement practices. This can be done by expanding Indigenous procurement set-asides and considering a similar approach to supporting rural businesses. Secondly, if internet is not available in a community, its members cannot fully participate in Canada's digital economy. Yet significant gaps still exist in rural broadband access. During our visit to Winnipeg, we met Michael, a young man from Clyde River in Nunavut. Michael's greatest desire for his community was to have high-speed internet access. In this regard, we encourage the Government of Canada to follow through on its ambitious target of having 90% of Canada's population with high-speed internet access by 2021. Finally, we recommend that the Government of Canada design more flexible labour market readiness programs. In our survey, we heard that only 30% of young people thought that their rural or Indigenous community had good schools and training programs. New structures for labour market readiness and skills development would support youth to remain living and working in their communities. Programs like British Columbia's Indigenous Skills Training Development Fund could provide a blueprint for future training initiatives and for programs delivered in partnership with the private sector. Our last theme is how to provide effective transition supports. We consistently heard that communities face significant challenges in navigating a patchwork of government funding sources.
L'un de nos panélistes nous l'a dit, les possibilités d'innovation et de faire les choses différemment abondent, mais les politiques publiques changent trop lentement. Les collectivités sont souvent obligées de travailler en marge des gouvernements.
First, we think that the Government of Canada should establish a single window to support communities' energy transition. Existing programs have different eligibility criteria and funding objectives, leading to time-consuming and fragmented application processes for communities that are seeking funding. Quebec recently established a single window called Transition énergétique Québec to deliver funding. A single window is already used for other federal programs as well, including the Clean Growth Hub to support clean technology exporters. A similar approach to fund the energy transition in rural and Indigenous communities could yield strong results, including through a harmonized application process. Second, we recommend that the Government of Canada adopt a technology-agnostic approach to funding the low-carbon energy transition. Diane mentioned the town of Hinton, Alberta earlier. Hinton struggled to access geothermal project funding sources because funds that existed were oriented towards wind and solar projects. Instead, We feel that all forms of renewable energy and emissions reduction technologies should have equal access to government funding and regulatory supports. Finally, because rural and Indigenous communities have different levels of planning and management capacity, we recommend that the Government of Canada provide a more tailored approach. Government can provide a wider spectrum of financing tools, including in the form of low-interest loans and loan guarantees. This type of non-grant financing instrument would allow the Government of Canada to use its AAA credit rating and low borrowing costs to improve the economic viability of community energy projects. While the federal government does provide loan guarantees for large projects like Muskrat Falls in Labrador, it does not currently guarantee loans for smaller projects. A loan guarantee instrument could mobilize additional private sector capital into this space and serve as a tool to increase communities' ownership in energy projects.
To wrap up, I would like to share a quote from one of the young people who responded to our Powerful Changes survey. "We are a bright and vibrant town with so much hope and resilience, and we believe that we can prevail. We can overcome these issues with a combination of great strength, hard work, and relentless drive. We will attain a better, more prolific community."
Merci beaucoup, Alex. Maintenant, à partir de cette étape ou de ce point-ci, la question c'est quelle est la prochaine étape? Évidemment, nous, le but de notre rapport, c'est de le présenter pour que vous appliquiez peut-être dans les différentes sphères dans lesquelles vous travaillez, ces recommandations, que ce soit dans des conversations, dans des projets, ou bien dans des décisions qui seront faites dans le futur par rapport aux questions énergétiques canadiennes. Et pour aider à poursuivre la discussion également, on a trouvé que l'une des façons qui pourrait être intéressante, ce serait de résumer nos recommandations à l'aide d'un vidéo de 2 minutes qui, comme vous allez voir, reprend certains des éléments clés de la présentation qu'on a faite. Et aujourd'hui, on aimerait vous présenter ce vidéo en guise de conclusion. Et vous allez voir, le vidéo va être présenté, mais vous allez pouvoir également le trouver sur le site web qui va être affiché et sur le compte Twitter également qui va être affiché à l'écran. Alors, je demanderais si jamais on est capable de mettre la vidéo à ce moment-ci.
But what does this mean for rural and Indigenous communities? Rural and Indigenous communities are close to metals, oil and gas, forests, agricultural land, and fisheries of Canada's important export economy. People and the rest of Canada could inject billions of dollars Canadians. But the economic activity is tied to carbon-intensive industries. Climate policy decisions will have long-term consequences, so we asked communities and experts in energy and economic development about a path forward. Here's what we found. The federal government must develop policies that adapt to diverse geographies, economic situations, and local values. Communities must get support for community energy planning through direct financial support and better data collection. Entrepreneurs and skilled young people need education opportunities they can access at home. And the federal government must deliver on its broadband internet targets so people and businesses can stay globally connected. The federal government should develop a single window for energy transition programs and offer a wider spectrum of financing tools. We are a group of Action Canada Fellows. We envision a low-carbon, affordable, and resilient Canadian energy future. In this future, rural and Indigenous communities are vibrant places to live and work. Their integrated economies thrive in nation-to-nation partnerships. They are friends in low-carbon places.
Merci beaucoup. Alors, vous avez vu le lien ici, mais également sur le compte Twitter et sur le site Internet du programme Votre avenir énergétique. Le lien va être disponible si vous voulez partager la vidéo et on vous invite à le faire. Et on est également très heureux de répondre à vos questions en français ou en English.
Thank you. So first I'll invite our panel of advisors and mentors, Carol Swan, Brian Topp, André Junot, and Richard Discerny, to respond to the presentation. The panel will take turns responding to each of the 3 presentations, and I don't know who they have identified to respond to each, so I invite whoever you've decided amongst the group. Please go ahead.
We will start in recognition of the most senior, wise, elderly person. That would be me. Thank you for your presentation, both the document as well as the oral presentation and the video. A few comments, but first I'll give you a question that I would like each one of you to answer at the end. So I'll give you the question at the beginning so that you don't have to, on the spot, respond. If all of your recommendations and suggestions were put in place, were implemented, what would be the DNA of Canada's rural Indigenous community in the year 2040? What would be the 3 characteristics that you would say, it worked, or this is how different? So give that some thought as but at the same time, please keep listening to what I'm about to say. I commend you first for the good data that you have at the front end. Good public policy always has as an essential component solid data, the absence of which makes it difficult to build going forward. Too often, anecdote replaces analysis, and in this case, you start with a good foundation, including, for example, that rural Indigenous communities provide 60% of exports, many of those commodity-based, obviously. Major source, in part because of that, of GHG emission. Major home for 60% of Indigenous people. You identify in the core of your presentation a challenge that is occurring worldwide. If you look at the migration that is taking place from rural setting to urban setting, let it be the major migrations taking place in China, let it be the major migration that is taking place in Africa as people escape war, as people escape the impact of climate change and create an environment where you can't live because there's no water and there's no crop. We are seeing this major migration taking place in many other countries. So what you're trying to focus on is indeed a worldwide various programs. In nature, chances are it will apply to different regions, it will apply to different communities who have different demographics, and it will be kind of undistinguishable and have the same non-applicability to different communities because it has to be national, it has to have different criteria that meets all communities. In your deliberations, did you take a step back and consider that perhaps the national government in certain areas, and I give you labor market training and labor market programs as one area, should simply evacuate the domain because labor markets are fundamentally local, they're a little bit regional, maybe to an extent provincial, but generally speaking, they are not national. You can have national numbers, but the intrinsic DNA of a labor market, of a community, is local. So why should the national government continue to operate in a major way? Should it not simply decentralize to the provincial and subsequently regional or local authorities in order to make the many of the suggestions that you put forth have a chance of being implemented? I don't say that for other national endeavors, such as connecting via wireless broadband. There are national programs that have a national interest. But since at the core your project is about keeping rural Indigenous communities whole and keep in all of its dimensions, did you in your travels across the country give some thought to trying to, in some ways, reverse the wave that is occurring? Normal economic forces lead to migration towards major urban centers, and your paper alludes to the fact that there's a trend. And in some ways, you're trying a massive attempt at social engineering to stop this phenomenon, which, as I say, is occurring worldwide. So I submit to you generally, have you thought about more radical interventions to achieve those outcomes? And secondly, don't forget the first question I asked as to what the DNA would look like. With that, my colleague.
Thank you, Richard. I have some questions and some observations. My first observation is that your work has identified or has which means that, as usual, there remains, in a number of cases, it seems to me, the question of how you do it. And in my experience in public policy is the how part is often the most difficult part. Having identified where you should go, how you get there is critical. Second observation is to congratulate you on the 30% statistic. 30% of Canadians live in smaller communities. It's a much better statistic than the one often hears, that 80% of Canadians live in cities, which is a completely goofy statistic. So it's very helpful that you focused on that 30%. On the other hand, I'll criticize you for your 60% statistic, exports coming from rural areas. Where do you think those exports are financed? They're financed in downtown Toronto. They're financed in Vancouver for a lot of mining, and so on. So the distinction between what happens economically between rural areas and urban areas is one that that deserves, I think, a little bit more attention if you're looking for, if you want to understand relationships. My last observation before a few questions is not unrelated to something Richard said very politely. Despite the criticism that came from James, among others, about the Ottawa-centered views, a lot of what you want to do, you're suggesting ought to come from the federal government. If that's so, then you're asking for the federal government to change its DNA to use that line, if you believe what you said, which I would be prepared to debate. I have a couple of questions. One is very interesting to start with the two communities. Have you given any thought to why it is that those communities were inclined to develop a vision? You say that's what they did. Why are they developing visions? Why is it that other communities are not? What are the local factors that would explain this? And to the extent that they're not totally accidental, are there lessons to learn from that? My second question is not unrelated is related to my observation, is a number of your recommendations are addressed to the federal government. What do you think is the federal government's comparative advantage in these areas? I should add, by the way, that je devrais le dire dans les deux langues, mais parler de solutions nationales, c'est la meilleure façon de vous assurer que le Québec n'écoutera pas. Talk about national policies, that takes Quebec out of the picture. They cannot stand that term, and there's a very simple solution, and you use it somewhere in your material, pan-Canadian, for instance. But don't say national if you want to be listened to. I say this to you, and I say this to you in your ongoing careers. One of your specific recommendations is to engage communities in national policy development. There would be a lot to be said about that. I spent a lot of my time working with the regional components of the departments I was in to see how they could be involved. I won't tell you how ugly it got at times. But I think you need to have some ideas beyond having exchanges. It's not a bad idea having exchanges, although for the smaller communities, it's not obvious, to be a little bit pretentious about it, where the capacity would be in a small community to send somebody to work in Ottawa. But so I think that you're on to an important idea how communities can participate in community development. As you know, provinces struggle with that too. So how does one actually engage beyond relatively, individual exchanges? I'll leave it at that.
I don't think you get to talk, do you? Merci. Thank you very much for this this report and the presentation. This is a very complex area, and I was very happy to see the sense of optimism and enthusiasm that you brought to it. I have two questions for you. One relates to some of the references in your report to place-based approach to rural policies, to lived experience, to capacity building. James referenced it in terms of making sure it's not just an Ottawa-centric approach that one brings to these very important issues. So you did community engagement, you did academic research, and I was wondering if you could just expand a little bit, what would be the best practices that you found in terms of actually trying to make sure there is a wider diversity of views brought to bear from communities, and that policymakers, who largely, federally certainly would be in Ottawa, would have the capacity then to understand places in a different way. Second question relates to your recommendations, which I think if you put them all together would be fairly costly in terms of implementing. I didn't see a dollar figure. That would be a hard thing to ask you to cost, but I think we can agree they would be potentially fairly costly to implement. So to ask you, if the federal government said to you, okay, you can have one of these recommendations, but only one. And I know you've done this as an integrated piece, but which recommendation would you say would be the most important for the federal government to implement?
Thank you. I neglected to mention earlier that 3 of the members of the panel worked closely as mentors to the groups, and so in the interest of transparency, we're inviting the mentor that worked with their group to not respond after each presentation, which is why Brian didn't offer any comments. And after the next group, Andre will abstain, and after the third group, Carol will abstain. So starting with Bruno, we'll now go through the group and offer you all an opportunity to respond to the comments and questions of the panel. So we'll start with Bruno, and then Lindsay, Alex, James. We'll finish with Diane, and then we'll open the floor to, we have time for just maybe 1 or 2 questions for this group. Bruno?
We're trying to figure out an order, because we were bombarded from different angles, and we're trying to figure out a strategy. But let me start with this. I think I will tackle the interjurisdictional question, the federal-provincial question, because, and I will acknowledge that this was an issue that kept coming up, and I think not just in our group, and I think to address André's point, we want to have a pan-Canadian lens, but many of these questions also relate to provincial jurisdiction, and we do acknowledge this in our report, and I think this is important. We recognize this. I would say from our angle particularly, first of all, Indigenous, First Nations, Métis, Innu would fall under federal jurisdiction. There would be a strong role. For rural communities, we see the role of the federal government to be a role of facilitating, so aligning interest, for example, between provinces and the federal government, with the funds as well, bring money to the table. And this is also what we tried to say when we were presenting one of our guiding principles, which was cooperation between different jurisdictions. And I think to your question, particularly whether we thought about just perhaps leaving the field in terms of labor policies to provinces. No, I think our angle was more to enhance cooperation. And we draw this from various sources. For example, the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth does bring together the federal government and the provinces for some measures that tackle remote communities, which are rural as well. So there's cooperation in that regard, and we want to go in that path as well of jurisdictional cooperation. And the same thing was proposed in Pathways to a Low Carbon Future, a report that was presented to NRCan by a very big group of academics, 50 or so, I think. One of their principal recommendation was to implement the recommendation regarding energy in general in Canada. We need stronger cooperation between provinces and the federal government. So instead of asking ourselves whether we should leave the field completely to the provinces, we had more of an idea of enhancing cooperation and levying the tools that the federal government can bring to the table in a complementary way with provinces. And perhaps to Carol's point on place-based policymaking, it's interesting because our approach to this doctrine, I would say, really finds its roots in the literature of the OECD. So back in 2006, the OECD was a very big proponent of what they coined the place-based policymaking. And it trickled down, and in Canada as well, we have seen many people pushing for this approach, which really emphasizes so instead of picking sectors and picking winners within different sectors, it really builds on the capacity of a place to create the tools and to be locally grounded, for the policies to be locally grounded. And that also means building capacity within these communities. And I think that's why there's a very important dynamic between our recommendation, because when we talk about, for example, grants for community-led energy plans, well, that talks as well to what communities need. They can access these grants to actually figure out what is the best way forward in terms of looking at the policies that would be applicable to them and drawing on the lived experience from the community as well. And I should say that you requested a particular example, and we do have one report, and Lindsay will talk a little bit about it as well.
Yeah, I think I'll address both Carol and Andre's questions about integrating lived experience into policymaking. And I just want to preface this by saying we acknowledge there is a lot of lived experience already in the different levels of government with respect to what it's actually like to live in rural and Indigenous communities. But what we heard very clearly from the experts that we talked to is that such experience wasn't necessarily consistent, and that the policies that impacted their communities, they felt didn't necessarily always come from a place of lived experience. So wanting more of that. So besides the comments and work exchanges that we talked about, what were some other practical ideas that we had or ideas that we got from our experts? So one of them would be to potentially decentralize operational policymaking staff, so not just quite centered in big cities or in Ottawa, but maybe through more regional offices or remote work arrangements to allow people to actually stay closer to their communities. That might help get some more lived experience in. There's also the idea of providing supports to people who live in rural and Indigenous communities to help them get the right kinds of education and experience to enable them to participate or consider policymaking careers. And then we also heard from others that they thought perhaps rural and Indigenous lived experience could be given greater weight in hiring decisions or potentially promotions within the government sector, the public sector. So those are some things we heard. In terms of your question about best practices, one of the best practices that was brought to our attention is actually in our report, we kind of highlighted as well. So Nova Scotia, it's the Brass Door Lakes a steering committee that meets the federal, provincial, municipal, and the Indigenous governments there. And so they meet quarterly to talk about what's important to them, what are the challenges, and what are they hoping to do for the future, and that information is taken and pulled into policy development. So we understand this approach can't be taken everywhere all the time, but it is one example of a best practice that we had found.
All right, so I think I identified 3 opportunities for me to do my best to answer your questions. So we have Carol and your data reference comment. Could you elaborate just a little more on what you meant by our data references? Because you said you had questions on our references?
No, sorry. I was just asking my question about place-based.
Oh, okay.
And using that as an indication
Sure.
that you had studied these things.
Okay.
So, no further question on that thing.
Okay, perfect. And then second, Andre, you mentioned about cities financing the rural and Indigenous economy. And I think you actually nailed a point that I am very passionate about and very passionate about talking about, in that all of Canada is dependent on resources developed in rural areas. And sometimes it's easy for people in the city like me, I work for an oil and gas corporation, to forget that we operate in sensitive rural and Indigenous environments. And just how important it is for all of Canada to recognize that it's not necessarily a rural-urban divide, and that is not what we wanted to highlight. We more wanted to show that all Canadians, especially because I'm going to take a wild guess and say that most of us live in an urban center of greater than 30,000 people. Like, is there anyone in this room who lives in a community under 30,000? Well, exactly. And we don't always recognize the contributions that rural Canada brings to our export economy. So I think you're absolutely right. We weren't trying to show a divide. We just merely wanted to illustrate just how important rural and Indigenous resources are to all of Canada. Is that fair? Okay. Ooh, and there was another question. How did these, I believe it was from Richard, how did these communities change their narrative from like a fossil fuel or a carbon-intensive economy, and how did they transition, or how did they build the capacity? So Hinton is very near and dear to my heart as a geophysicist. They are a geothermal heating district project, and they built capacity through outside forces, partnering with the municipality. So you had the U of A intentionally identifying Hinton as an oil and gas rich area that has extensive data points to illustrate the high amounts of heat. So U of A identified Hinton as a great location. And then second, what was it? Right, you had outside business experts entering into municipal politics. So they had a mayor who had he was a CEO of either a small power or oil and gas company, and he was able to use his strong business expertise to build the Hinton geothermal heating district, at least get it to where they could apply for funding and prove feasibility. So to me, it was external forces and programming that allowed for Hinton to have this magnificent opportunity, and now I believe they have $1.2 million in both provincial and federal funding that they've been working for years. And we identified some of those issues, which they were not considered the same type of renewable as wind and solar. They couldn't apply for the same funding mechanisms. So we're very excited for this opportunity to cultivate it for themselves.
So I'll address the question about the federal government's comparative advantage, and then also Carol's question about the cost and if we could only pick one. So just around the comparative advantage of the federal government, I think that the first thing, and maybe it's obvious, but the national perspective that the Government of Canada brings to an issue. I take the point about pan-Canadian frameworks versus national policies, and that's definitely a lesson to remember through my career. What I would also say is that the federal government has a clear role in convening provincial and territorial governments. So I think that there's the influence that the federal government has, both what's called soft influence and then maybe influence through regulatory, tax systems, legislation. What I'd also say, the federal government has a very broad toolkit in issues that affect rural and Indigenous communities. I mean, there's definitely a strong provincial role here. We can't deny that. But the federal government has ministries like agriculture, fisheries, natural resources, working on many issues that are really important to rural and Indigenous communities. And obviously, when it comes to Indigenous issues, the federal government has a clear fiduciary role when it comes there. I think the final thing I would say, when we started talking about non-grant instruments and some of the new tools that we would propose, the federal government has a very low cost of funds. We have a AAA credit rating, and we can share that with projects in some cases. And I think that that is a key thing that the federal government also brings to the table. In terms of the cost of these proposals, and if we could only have one, what I would first say is that I don't think we conceived our recommendations to actually be that expensive. We think of them as bringing more coherence to an existing system. That's why the single window is one of those ideas where if communities that have limited capacity to engage in application processes and seek, go through a complex funding process to get funds, what they end up doing usually is hiring fairly expensive consultants. And I think that we think that if we could try to reduce the transaction costs of getting funding from the government, that would be advantageous. What I'd also say is that a lot of the non-grant instruments that we were talking about, I mean, I think what we were really thinking about for the low-interest loans or the loan guarantees, is a $50 to $100 million pilot program. And I think that we've seen the government getting more and more into the innovative financing space, and I think that a small program initially would show strong results in the future. And the last thing, one more thing. The last thing on community energy planning, I'd also just like to emphasize how small these projects are. We're thinking $100,000 or $200,000 to help a community do an energy plan and think about the role energy plays in that community. And I think in the grand scheme of federal funding, that's a very small amount of money for communities. So I don't think we think that these have to be necessarily quite expensive proposals.
That's okay. So I'm going to finish by trying to do a little bit of a story and a shotgun approach to sort of filling in some of the gaps to the questions that were asked here. So in terms of what communities look like if we do a good job, I'm going to actually refer to what they told us in our surveys. So what they wanted was they wanted good jobs in sectors like the digital economy, in natural resource sectors. They're looking for economically independent areas. They're looking for reconciled relationships between rural and First Nations communities. And what we would say is that future does actually look different in many cases for rural and Indigenous communities in terms of how much change that will be. So for rural communities, we heard we want to protect what we have in a lot of cases, or slow some of the changes that we see happening. One of the comments we heard from one of the First Nations people we spoke to was that, there's nowhere to go but up for us, and that's really where we want to go. I mean, she said the worst case scenario going forward is exactly what we have now, and I thought that was a really powerful thing to think about in terms of where we go. In terms of why, the vision for the low carbon future, I think that those for both communities really ties to these main things that we heard from communities, which is that economic development is a priority, and that the resilience is really, going forward in technological change, whether that's technological change in energy or in a digital future. It's about creating diversification because of the real lack of consensus and real sort of uncertainty about the role of oil and gas, especially for those who are not experts, and this real commitment to the social and environmental sustainability. So that low carbon development really falls in aligns with that, and that's why communities are coming up with these low carbon visions. In terms of really looking at why rural and Indigenous communities, why we're talking about the enormous job of protecting these communities where they are, instead of just saying, okay, well, there's this migration happening, that's in response to economic conditions. It's sort of a natural thing. Why shouldn't it just happen? Well, first, I would certainly say that Indigenous communities have been very clear that they're not going to just stop existing and move to cities. There's an enormous commitment to stay on traditional lands, to which there's a real sacred connection, and that's not unlike what many rural communities feel about their lands. I mean, they feel very connected and in social and spiritual ways to those lands as well. And part of Canada is our identity outside of cities. So there's a real interest in protecting that, and it's something we heard very strongly from those who live in the communities, that they want to protect these communities. And frankly, Ken Coates, who's a professor at the University of Saskatchewan, warned us and warned sort of all of Canada that cities are also not prepared for a mass exodus out of rural areas with people who have skills that are not necessarily urban skills to come and all of a sudden move into our cities as well. So there's a real impetus to protect those communities going forward, which leads me to talk a little bit about, again, Richard, your question about labor market programs. I'm not sure I have an answer in terms of should the federal government get out of labor market programming. I will say that they have a definite role in labor market programming on reserve, certainly. And one of our recommendations is that the programming, whether it's through provincial, and actually our example is a provincial program in this case, or a federal program, is that it leverages relationships with the private sector, because right now the private sector is doing a really good job of training people in the communities. There's an example in our report from the Blueberry First Nation where the oil companies are doing a really good job of training people for the oil fields. In northern Manitoba, the contracting companies do a really good job of training people on First Nations to work in hydro development. So those partnerships have to be a key part of that. And certainly the latest budget doesn't signal any indication that the federal government is trying to get out of this, because there was a very large renewal of programming for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people in terms of labor market training, although there's certainly no program that we can see in terms of rural training, and we really think that that's a mistake, because we really think that rural communities need on-site skills training, because in order to fight against this depopulation that's happening in rural areas and in First Nations communities, young people need to stop going to the city for school and never coming home, much like I did. I'm from a northern community. I grew up off-grid, and I went to university, and I never have gone home, and I never will.
25 after 10. Thank you. It's now my pleasure to introduce our second task force. We have Kay Shi, Catherine Pinault, Apoorv Sinha, Madhwanika Fanor-Cadet, and Graham Reed.
All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today at our presentation. We'd like to appreciate that we're on unceded Algonquin territory. The title of our report is called Work in Progress, Empowering Canada's Workforce in the Global Energy Transition. My name is Kay Shi. I'm based out of Calgary, Alberta. To my left, we have Catherine Pinault. She's based out of Montreal. Apoorv Sinha, he's based out of Calgary. Madhwanika Cadet, she's based out of Montreal/Washington, D.C. And Graham Reed, and he is based out of Ottawa. So our report is essentially about people. As governments tackle climate change and transition to a clean energy future, people, workers, particularly those employed in traditional energy sectors such as coal, oil, and gas, are worried about their livelihoods. People are scared that they will be left behind in this clean energy transition. So, how can Canada support and empower its citizens, particularly those most vulnerable? And we've identified those groups to be displaced workers, immigrants, and Indigenous people, to not only participate, but lead the global energy transition. No, there we go. What do we mean when we say Canada should be leaders in the global energy transition? To us, to be world leaders, our energy workforce must be resilient to market and policy shocks, respond to labor market signals with agility, and support the most vulnerable to seize new training and job opportunities. Like I said, let's go back. Like I said, our report is about people. Because who is this energy transition relevant to? It's relevant to everyone. And if you look at the pictures of the people on the screen, you'll notice how diverse the people are that it affects. And we had a chance to talk to the people and hear the stories of these people and how the energy transition will impact them. Well, not the baby, because she can't speak, but we included her in our presentation to remind ourselves that this conversation and this transition will be impacting a generation of Canadians who can't be part of the public policy making process yet. But we did talk to people like Liam Hildebrand. He's the gentleman in the bottom corner. Liam is a boilermaker who worked in Alberta's oil sands, and he was laid off a couple of years ago, especially as the oil prices fell in Alberta. He and his friends formed an organization called Iron and Earth, and the mission of this organization is to train and empower tradespeople for renewable energy development. This is an example of how the clean energy transition can create challenges and opportunities in people's lives. Now I will turn it over to my colleagues who will walk you through the report that you have in front of you and our recommendations.
Merci, Kay. Dans nos discussions avec des experts pendant nos consultations, on a pu constater qu'il est crucial de s'entendre sur certaines hypothèses relativement au futur énergétique du Canada. Donc, ce n'est pas toujours facile de s'entendre sur des hypothèses qui font consensus sur les questions énergétiques, mais il y a quand même des grandes lignes sur lesquelles il est possible de s'entendre. Donc, premièrement, la transition vers une économie faible en carbone est inévitable et elle est déjà en marche. Donc, on voit qu'elle est déjà en marche, premièrement, par l'évolution des prix relatifs sur les marchés de l'énergie. Ensuite, pour l'attention de plus en plus importante portée aux politiques énergétiques. Elle est inévitable parce que la part des gaz à effet de serre qui sont attribuables à la consommation et à la production d'énergie est vraiment importante. pour atteindre les cibles de réduction d'émissions qui vont nous permettre de ralentir les changements climatiques, on a besoin d'une transition vers des sources d'énergie qui sont plus faibles en carbone. Cette transition-là doit être relativement rapide. Enfin, des mesures seront prises dans les secteurs publics et privés pour assurer la pérennité de l'industrie énergétique canadienne. Même si les énergies fossiles sont appelées à prendre une part graduellement moins importante au niveau mondial, le Canada a le potentiel de rester un gros joueur énergétique. Donc, on peut penser notamment aux nouvelles technologies en énergie, à l'innovation, à la contribution à différentes étapes de la chaîne de production des technologies en énergie renouvelable, ainsi qu'à la production d'énergie renouvelable, pour lequel le Canada a un potentiel important. Donc, l'industrie de l'énergie, on l'a entendu beaucoup pendant cette année, est à l'aube de bouleversements importants. Ceux-ci vont induire une plus grande volatilité. Donc, on pense aux progrès technologiques qui contribuent à l'évolution des prix relatifs des différentes sources d'énergie, aux politiques mondiales qui évoluent relativement à l'énergie et au climat, et aux réalités géopolitiques en évolution. Tout ça sont des facteurs qui sont à considérer en même temps. C'est sans compter les bouleversements pour toutes les industries qui pourraient provenir de l'automatisation. Donc, prédire les changements dans le futur énergétique relativement au marché du travail n'est pas très réaliste et ce n'est pas notre prétention aujourd'hui. Donc, on peut toutefois anticiper l'augmentation de la volatilité, puis on peut s'y préparer. On est ici aujourd'hui pour vous parler des gens et on va vous parler de leur rôle de travailleurs. On s'entend pour dire que les travailleurs pourront, à travers les bouleversements de l'industrie, soit évoluer dans celle-ci ou encore en sortir et aller vers d'autres industries. Enfin, les politiques publiques ont un rôle à jouer et devraient être technologiquement neutres. On s'entend sur le fait que les politiques publiques ont un rôle de support à jouer pour la transition elle-même, qui est nécessaire, et un rôle potentiel pour apporter un soutien pour faire face aux effets de la transition. Donc, à partir de ces hypothèses-là, il était ensuite possible de se pencher sur le fonctionnement du marché du travail. Pour bien comprendre la complexité du marché du travail, on a utilisé une approche systémique. On a élaboré une carte qui met en relief certaines interrelations et interactions importantes du marché du travail. Vous pouvez la retrouver au milieu de notre rapport. Évidemment, cette carte est une représentation simplifiée. Je vous guide à travers les éléments qui nous ont intéressés le plus. Donc, un des moyens par lesquels les politiques publiques peuvent assurer le succès de la transition énergétique, c'est en améliorant les conditions de l'appariement entre les compétences qui sont offertes par les Canadiens et les compétences qui sont demandées sur le marché du travail. Donc, on s'est concentré davantage sur les politiques qui affectent le côté de l'offre de travail. Donc, de l'information peut être collectée et émerger de ce qui se passe sur le marché du travail. On pense à des informations comme les salaires, les tendances, les besoins anticipés, le nombre d'emplois, leur nature, leur localisation, qui est importante relativement aussi à la dernière présentation qu'on a entendue, et les compétences qui sont requises et vont être requises dans les prochaines années. Ces informations-là sont des signaux qui peuvent être plus ou moins bien transmis et captés par le bassin des travailleurs potentiels. Donc, pensons tantôt à la jeune professionnelle qui était dans notre photo ou au bébé sur la première diapositive. Ces gens-là vont prendre les signaux puis les utiliser pour faire leur choix relatif à leur vocation et à leur formation. Leur formation va les amener à être prêts à offrir leurs compétences et leurs talents à des employeurs et à la société canadienne. Donc, les immigrants et les travailleurs déplacés n'ont pas nécessairement besoin d'autant de formation que les nouveaux travailleurs, mais ils peuvent toutefois avoir besoin d'autres types de soutien et peuvent bénéficier de signaux clairs.
Thank you, Catherine. As we discussed our vision for what the future of the labor market might look like, our group decided to focus on the following question. How can we prepare Canada's workforce to lead the global clean energy sector in 2050? We believe that Canada's clean tech worker in 2050 can be the equivalent of a German manufacturer today. Reliable, adaptable, and most importantly, resilient. 2050 might seem far away, but to realize the vision that we aim for in our question, we believe that we need to act today. A favorable policy framework needs to be put in place to facilitate our goal and to help people that are not just in the workforce today, but the ones that are going to join it in the near future. After extensive literature review and public engagement, we believe that the framework must rely on 3 critical cogs. We believe the framework needs to inform people that are in the workforce about where their contribution could be best used and what kind of skills they might require. We need to train them in gaining the requisite skills so that they can be most effective in how they can contribute to our workforce. And finally, we believe support for these people is required to make informed decisions so that they can enter the workforce and stay in it over a prolonged period of time. These 3 cogs are critical elements that need to be implemented well if the goal of leading the global energy workforce is to be achieved. And for this, these elements need to be seamlessly integrated through lubrication in the form of patient and deliberate governance. With our very first cog, our objective is to inform people that are already in the workforce or are looking to enter the workforce, particularly in the energy sector. We believe that to achieve this, we need to give them access to the most up-to-date, reliable information about the energy sector so they can make the best possible decisions about how they can get involved. To achieve this, the information needs to be industry-wide in its scope, and it needs to be disseminated in different areas across Canada with local nuance so that the information is both relevant and usable. Importantly, we think that the aggregated data that is currently available through sources like labor market opinions and other sources needs to be supplemented with specifics that can be used by aspirational workers in the energy force to make informed decisions. The information needs to be tailored to answer the specific question of how does this data help a new graduate or someone with 30 years experience in the energy workforce determine where to shape their career moving forward. 2 particular recommendations that we had were developing an LMI portal on an open government website to share labor market efforts at a provincial, federal, territorial, and municipal level. Secondly, we also thought that launching an annual pan-Canadian competition to analyze labor market data from across the country with the objective of forecasting energy jobs of the future would be an excellent initiative. This competition will intend to develop and disseminate new predictive algorithms for where the energy jobs of the future may lie, and this might better prepare Canada as a whole for what the future holds for us.
Merci à Pourv. Donc, je vais donc poursuivre avec les recommandations qui concernent la formation, le soutien et la gouvernance. Donc, la formation. Les travailleurs actuels et futurs dans le domaine de l'énergie doivent être formés de manière à s'adapter à un secteur énergétique volatile, comme Catherine l'a exprimé plus tôt, amené à connaître de nombreuses perturbations dans les 30 prochaines années. Cette formation doit être axée sur le perfectionnement des compétences complémentaires, le perfectionnement des compétences transférables et le renforcement des compétences de base des travailleurs dans le secteur énergétique. La formation sur les compétences complémentaires s'adresse aux travailleurs du secteur énergétique qui souhaitent être redéployés au sein même du secteur énergétique. On parle par exemple de travailleurs du charbon qui souhaiteraient passer au solaire ou à l'éolien. Nous recommandons donc de favoriser la transition des travailleurs vers les secteurs de l'énergie durable à travers le développement, le financement et la mise en œuvre de programmes de perfectionnement à court terme et reconnus dans tout le Canada. Cette reconversion pourrait s'effectuer par le biais de certificats correspondants qui sont spécialement utiles dans les sous-secteurs particulièrement instables dont les cycles d'expansion et de récession sont relativement courts, comme c'est le cas de l'industrie extractive du pétrole et du gaz. Lorsqu'il est question de transfert des compétences, on parle ici notamment de littératie, de numératie, de communication orale, mais également de formation pratique applicable à de multiples secteurs, par exemple la plomberie, chauffage ou l'électricité. Nous recommandons donc de créer des mesures d'incitation financière et fiscale pour les petites, moyennes et grandes entreprises, leur permettant d'accorder aux salariés du temps rémunéré dédié à leur développement professionnel, notamment pour suivre les programmes gouvernementaux d'acquisition de compétences transférables. Le Québec nous fournit ici un excellent exemple de cette mesure. En vertu notamment du crédit d'impôt pour la création d'emplois d'apprentis, tout toute entreprise de plus de 500 salariés doit investir au minimum 1% de sa masse salariale dans la formation de son personnel via des programmes approuvés. Le renforcement des compétences d'avenir offre aux salariés des secteurs de l'extraction et des énergies renouvelables la possibilité de consolider leur expérience dans leur domaine afin de garantir la compétitivité de leurs organisations et du Canada dans le secteur énergétique globalement. Nous recommandons donc de financer la création d'un programme de formation destiné aux travailleurs du secteur énergétique qui offre des possibilités de carrière liées au secteur énergétique à l'échelle provinciale, nationale et internationale. Ce type de programme devrait être technologiquement neutre, comme on l'a mentionné plus tôt, et axé sur un domaine énergétique, être subventionné afin d'être accessible à l'ensemble de la main-d'œuvre canadienne et s'étaler sur 1 ou 2 années aux côtés de multinationales qui mettent au point et déploient des projets d'énergie propre au Canada ou à l'étranger. Maintenant, soutenir. Pour nous, un soutien aux groupes vulnérables constitue une partie intégrante de la vision qui veut que la main-d'œuvre canadienne devienne un chef de file du secteur énergétique. Cela passe d'abord par une représentation accrue. Nous recommandons au gouvernement d'exiger que les projets financés par celui-ci et par les sociétés d'État élaborent des politiques d'approvisionnement inclusives en invitant particulièrement les entreprises employant des Autochtones et des immigrants à participer, comme c'est déjà le cas dans la chaîne d'approvisionnement de plusieurs entreprises. Par exemple, c'est le cas de l'Ontario Power Generation, donc un ami du programme, qui a mis en place une politique d'approvisionnement inclusive qui prévoit allouer un certain pourcentage des marchés aux entreprises autochtones locales. Ensuite, soutenir les travailleurs passe par un renforcement ciblé des capacités. Nous recommandons donc au gouvernement de soutenir et financer des programmes de mentorat destinés aux jeunes autochtones qui quittent leur communauté pour trouver un emploi, en facilitant un accès à des professionnels actifs de leur domaine, d'origine autochtone de préférence. Enfin, soutenir des professionnels passe par des programmes de stabilisation des revenus des travailleurs qui seraient potentiellement déplacés par la transition énergétique. Compte tenu de la concentration géographique des ressources, des communautés entières pourraient être menacées si rien n'est fait pour garantir une transition sans heurts. Nous recommandons donc d'envisager la création de fonds de transition dans les régions affectées en s'inspirant de l'Alberta et de son Alberta Coal Community Transition Fund, créé en 2017, afin de promouvoir la collaboration entre les différents ordres de gouvernement et soutenir les communautés affectées en s'assurant que ces subventions perçues par les travailleurs soient considérées comme un complément aux autres formes d'aide, par exemple l'assurance-emploi, et non comme un substitut. Enfin, informer, former, soutenir. Ces stratégies ne seront efficaces que si des mécanismes de gouvernance appropriés sont en place. Dans ce contexte, pour nous, le gouvernement devrait exiger que le Forum des ministres du marché du travail organise une réunion au cours de la prochaine année fiscale axée sur les informations du marché du travail, les IMT, et entrée à l'énergie, et créer un groupe de travail constitué des représentants de tous les gouvernements, y compris issus des gouvernements autochtones. Nous demandons aussi que le gouvernement crée un groupe de travail interministériel fédéral mandaté de collecter, analyser et communiquer les IMT et entrées à l'énergie. Ce groupe serait constitué des représentants de Statistique Canada, d'Emploi et Développement social Canada, de l'Office national de l'énergie, de Ressources naturelles Canada et d'autres ministères fédéraux compétents. Graham.
Merci, Madoua, and thanks to all the colleagues. As we see here, this is a presentation about people and their livelihoods. And as we heard over the last 15 minutes, how our recommendations attempt to recenter these dialogues, these policy dialogues on people in this transition. It's easy to see how, over the last 15 minutes, the technical jargon that permeates both policy programs and decision makings is quite difficult to follow along. And it's even easier to see how these faces actually get lost in that policy making. We hear stories from our friends in low carbon places and then potentially the rebuttal from some of the long-term Ottawa bureaucrats of the complexities of governing in a urban-rural kind of divide. But ultimately, we've had the opportunity over the last 10 months to hear some of these stories, to share in these experiences. And I want to highlight a few of those. We have in our top right corner, André, who happens to be sitting with us here, but a past federal public servant who has 40 years of experience to share with new people entering the workforce. We have Ashley in the bottom right corner, who's extremely qualified, who is currently carving out her future, her passions, and her experiences. And then we have Kyra to remind us how these policies and these decisions that we make today have repercussions long-term as she attempts to carve out her future. And we've heard sometimes that either now in this transition or earlier in other examples in Canadian history, how these faces are potentially lost. And so we asked the question in our report, what if we don't forget? And what if we provide people with the proper access to information, tailored information, access to flexible on-the-job training, as well as the requisite support to help those who potentially need more support to participate in our economy. And then how do we work together in a pan-Canadian framework, respecting our nation-to-nation commitments in a way that is productive for all. And we believe, and I think all of you in this room believe, that we can be leaders in the clean energy transition. I think arguably we are leaders in the clean energy transition, and through some of these mechanisms we can improve on that. So ultimately, what can you do in supporting the work that we're attempting to do to recenter these conversations on people? And we know that just by you listening in this room, listening online, that you care about this. You care about recentering people in these conversations. You care about Canada and how we can advance our priorities on the global scale and how we can lift everybody up together. And so we have 3 small take-home recommendations for us to continue this conversation. And the first is, in all of our decisions, whether policy or personal or other professional, center these conversations on people. Think of who can benefit and who can be impacted in whatever decisions you're making, and consider their experiences in how you decide. And seeing the diversity of people in the room really gives us great pride on how we can challenge you to talk to people who don't look like you. So maybe in the next 5-minute break, you can actually take an opportunity to identify someone and actually talk about their experiences and learn from one another. And then finally, obviously, you all have copies of our report. There are very clear recommendations on how to do some of the things that we talked about, and we encourage you all to read those, engage in this conversation, engage in us, and have an ongoing conversation. This is just the starting point, and we're looking forward to including and considering how people and climate policy can work together. Thank you. Miigwech. Merci à tous.
Thank you, Task Force 2. I'll now invite the panelists to respond. In the interest of time, I ask you to keep your comments to 3 minutes each, and I'll do the same to the task force, and then we'll have time for questions from the audience.
All right, I will. I'm going to begin. So let me begin by asking you a question that I will invite you to just think about while you are also listening to me.
That's my trick.
And then you can answer this in considerable detail when you get to the end. So that question is, was André Junot's mentoring not excellent? So let me begin by offering you some comments on your paper. I think it's an impressive piece of work and with much to commend it. And I want to begin by saying as was the case with the previous group, I think it is very commendable to begin by saying that we need to focus on the facts, that we need to get at the facts, we need to renew them every year. And the comments that you just concluded with, that always remember this is about people, is of course also at the heart of this. I think that is very good and very strong. You are surely right about the key role of training in the energy business, both the existing business and its future. And so you were right to highlight that, I think. And I think it is also very compelling to talk about the fact that access to training is a road to greater equality for for Aboriginal peoples and for new Canadians, and giving them a roadmap to greater participation in the economy. You are surely right about that, and it is very strong and good, I think, to include these themes in public policy. We should do more of that. And finally, I think your paper is very smart to recognize the complexity of the country, the fact that this is a federal state, that the federal government has to work through other jurisdictions to do much of what it wants to do. So nice stuff, very interesting. I have three questions in addition to my main one that I'll invite you to think about. So my first question, let me begin with a brief comment. This question of workforce training in the energy sector has been a wild roller coaster for a very long time. And if we were having this conversation 5 years ago, we would be having a completely different conversation in which we would be talking about, mind-numbing labor gaps, the inability to find workers for thousands of unfilled jobs, the need to ship people from across the country and to recruit desperately in other countries, to scale up as quickly as possible to deal with a massive petroleum boom that the country was riding on, that was in an era of $110 oil. And, a couple of $100 billion of capital earmarked into the Alberta oil sands that was going to all get built, an incredible construction boom. And not the first time, if I may say so, in the history of the prairies that such booms have had to be managed. So but as you all know, now what we're looking at is the withdrawal of most of that capital, the crash of that construction boom, and the question which you allude to recycle workers who were hoping that was their future into other jobs. So that's a pretty big change. So my first question is, what do you think about what this constant and likely to continue roller coaster in labor force requirements in energy? How does one need to deal with that? Could it be that diversification is the answer, both in markets and in terms of what it is that we're building, renewables versus fossil? My second question, and I asked this one mindful of my colleague Richard Discerni's comments in the last panel, is in light of what you have to say in this paper, was the federal withdrawal from workforce training a mistake? Because surely you know, as you felt your way into this file, that the federal government essentially withdrew from this area and delegated it to the provinces, and here you are proposing a fairly ambitious, and I would argue well argued and well reasoned case for federal action in this area. So, when you make the argument, for example, that workforce training is a key instrument for equality, does that not apply to other sectors of the economy? Or are you arguing that energy is a special case and the federal government should make an exception for its withdrawal from workforce training just for energy? In which case, why do you think that? And the last comment I would like to make speaks to the issue of the role of other stakeholders. So many argue, you alluded, for example, to the 1% payroll contribution.
Government, but in conjunction with provincial governments, have had. And my first trip to Ottawa many, many decades ago as a provincial public servant was to come to Ottawa to feed what at that time was the solution to good labor market information, which, believe it or not, was a huge equation into which provinces would input data and somebody would press a button, and the idea would be that we would have good labor market information on which people could base job decisions. And, that didn't really work. So we're still struggling with that challenge. Second observation is, as Brian has referenced a bit, you've picked an area that is fairly complex in terms of responsibilities between federal and provincial governments. Not that in any way should make us less interested in pursuing this, but it does, I think, add a level of complexity to moving ahead in this important area. Two questions. The first relates to your recommendation in relation to improved labor market information, but that you want to have job seekers have a human face to ask questions about labor market information. So my question is this really about questions about labor market information, or is this really about mentoring, career development, support at a basic level? Because I would like to hear your views on that. And secondly, appropriately, I think you recommend development of more apprenticeship programs. It used to be that apprenticeship programs were provincially constrained, and so there was limited mobility, even if people did manage to get apprenticeship programs and qualifications across the country. I'm wondering if you found in your research whether that was still existing, whether there were still barriers among movement in terms of apprenticeships.
Since Brian took 2.5 of my 3 minutes, I will have very few comments and two questions. The first one, I was Deputy Minister of Education, Post-Secondary Education, mid-90s in Ontario, and did a curriculum review, engaged all the sector and so forth, and I remember this well because not one of them had any suggestions or recommendation of tilting the curriculum at any level to acknowledge that Steve Jobs 10 years later would be developing an iPhone, and that many of his other colleagues in Silicon Valley would be developing technologies that would fundamentally change the workplace environment. So first question is, workforce training is extraordinarily important. No country can survive without having tremendous investment in workforce training. But how do you do so looking forward as compared to being caught by the rear view mirror? How does one do it? In your discussions, did you focus on the future in understanding what would be the outcomes? Secondly, in your discussions, did you run across a jurisdiction, a country that had, in your view, best practice, top quartile? Has any country, any jurisdiction mastered this concept through whatever mechanism of having a workforce that is adapted to the changing needs of societies? I would have said more, but fortunately out of time now because...
Same rule applies. Okay, sounds great. Well, thank you, everyone, for your questions. I think maybe I'll address a little bit of what Brian's questions and Richard's questions were about, which is this whole theme of uncertainty when we're trying to forecast in the future. And I'm reminded of one of the webinar seminars we had with David Dodge, former Bank of Canada governor, which is, you know, how do you create policy in an era of uncertainty? And you do the best you can based on the facts you have. But one of the things that we came up against in our conversations was we don't necessarily know what the new jobs of this new energy future will be. We don't know how many jobs there will be. We don't know especially how AI and automation are going to play a role in these numbers of jobs. So what we've tried to do is build policies that are as agile as possible to respond to whatever signals the labor market gives us. So that's in two part. It means having better signals so that the labor market can respond better. And the second part is equipping our workers with the skills so that they're able to respond to these signals and move into positions where they can be value add to the economy. And I think when we're talking about the subject of displaced workers, we don't necessarily see it as a bad thing in the short term. So a good labor market system works well when companies who are adding value to the economy succeed and thrive, and companies who aren't adding value to the economy are destroyed, for lack of a better word. But our job or our role is making sure that these displaced workers get back into good jobs quickly. And that's where our pillars of inform and train, and in some cases support, because there will be sometimes a lag between when they're laid off and when they get back into these good jobs where they will need extra support. So those were kind of the themes of the conversations we had.
Thank you. So to Richard's question about how to do workforce training without looking in the rear view mirror. So I think it's what we've put in a report is that it's important in labor market information to not be only about the past, but also to be prospective about labor market information and not only collect data about what happened, but also look at trends. We've talked to Michelle Brennigan that does great work with HR and electricity to do active LMI and talk with businesses and talk with everybody in the industry to know what's coming up, what they think is coming up, and to give that information in ways that are important. So we base the first cog in firm, and we think that having the proper information is really important, and that can bring us into doing workforce training that is also forward-looking. To Brian's question about is diversification what we should aim for, I think we're seeing it now that the companies themselves are aiming at diversification. So we've seen, and we've talked with oil and gas companies that are now talking about themselves as energy companies, and that are also investing in having and being technology companies. And we think that training the workforce and having the companies participate in the training of their own workforce will help them transition from being sector-specific to being more wide and being more agile. And that will help the workforce. To the question, is energy a special case? Well, after talking about energy for a full year, we would be tempted to say yes, perhaps. But I think why to look at energy right now as a special case for all of our recommendation and for LMI particularly, I think it's the energy industry will have important policy impact right now. So we're talking about strong climate policies, for example, that will induce some volatility in the energy industry. So we can take the energy industry and as an area to experiment with as to how to be better with our policies. And if it works well and we want to scale it up to the other industries, like it would be a great opportunity to do so. Finally, for Carol's story, I really appreciated your big equation, and then we put, as being an economist, I think that's sometimes how we think, like there's a big equation, we just need to figure it out. And what we thought is that opening the data to the public by putting all the available information, may it be raw or treated on an open portal, can empower local communities and organizations to actually use the information in the way that they need, and to do a data competition that is what, like, how do we find a big equation, basically, and to put forward those algorithms to the public. So that's how data competitions usually work. There's the World Bank uses that a lot, and their latest data competition was to have data scientists across the world try to predict the evolution of diseases. And then the winner in the data competition they receive a prize, but they also need to release their algorithm, and it becomes public knowledge. So it helps all organizations to sort of try to figure out that equation. So I think it's an interesting way of working. Thanks for all of your comments.
I think Catherine just pulled a Brian on me. I think she took more than 2.5 of my minutes, but but I'll try very quickly. I'll start with Carol as well. I think your point on LMI being difficult was something we're exposed to right from the start by Andre, and we saw that with the rest of our key informants as well. I think where we believe that there's a lot of scope for improvement is to leverage the information age and be able to use social media and basically the internet to make sure that this information is gathered not just from provincial sources, but from private sources. So we can't really predict 10 year, what the next Steve Jobs is going to be in 10 years. But what we can do is talk to them every 6 months or every year and see what their hiring strategies are and what kind of talent they'll be looking for in the near term. And so to promote those kind of strategies where there's constant routine interaction with small disruptive companies as well as with larger players, we think is a good way of making LMI a little less challenging. You asked about the face-to-face mentoring and whether that was just for training or for support purposes as well. And I think you hit the nail on the head. It's definitely for both. We think that for indigenous populations and for remote communities, it's important that we don't just put a framework in place which has all the ingredients that they need to train themselves, but they also need the kind of counseling that's required for them to succeed and be confident about their foray into the clean energy market. And you asked also about apprenticeships or internships on a federal level. And just over the last 5 or 6 years, the youth employment strategy by NRCan and the National Research Council has been deployed on a pan-Canadian basis. And so they have been looking at interns that can be hired across Canada through delivery programs that are specific to different provinces. So we do think that there's a window there that can be exploited to come up and support programs like the Iron and Earth program and others, so that upskilling can be done on a local level and still be relevant from a federal context. I wanted to finish with 2 points very quickly. First was the point that Brian and Richard both made about the uncertainty, and diversification is definitely not something we'd argue with, but we also think the real key improvement as a system would be in agility. So if there is more constant feedback between the different players in the labor market, both on the supply side, which we focused on, but also the demand side, that will help the economy and the entire workforce be a bit more resilient. And at a federal level, it's important that the government is paying close attention to the international context. So with the price of oil, there's an important international element that, you know, Alberta could have been blindsided by for fair reasons, being a province, but really the Canadian government could potentially have done a better job of seeing what the trends are at a global scale. And lastly, to answer Brian's question, which no one has yet, Andre was great. And he and I'd just like to thank Cheryl as well, because she was there helping us with some of our teamwork challenges that we had early on. So I think a special mention goes to her too. But yeah, no complaints.
Thank you, Porson. I actually wanted to start by acknowledging that Andrew was an excellent mentor to make sure that we don't forget to answer this question. But thank you. Definitely, your Port tackled this for the whole team already. So in terms of Brian's questions regarding diversification and workforce training in the energy sector, I would say that we built a report being very cognizant of the fact of volatility and the fact that also that the energy transition is also induced by policymaking. So when we built our COGS with the informed, trained support and the way that this we'd be able to prepare the Canadian workforce in energy transition, that definitely took into account that volatility, and that definitely took into account the fact that it is a roller coaster, and that's how could we build a recommendation in a way that could be very perennial and dependent on those changes, and not just very specific for one moment in time or one event that has an impact on the market. Maybe in terms of the role of other stakeholders, like we do, I would not say that we would. They would say that there should be a federal mandate of companies to participate, but that's definitely being able to have on-the-job training. It's definitely something that would be good for them on the short and the long term. So that's, I think there's even something organic with having them being able to participate and act as stakeholders within our whole strategy. To Carol's point about apprenticeship programs and specifically about our research, I would say that the short answer is yes. Like we did come across in our research, we came across the fact that there is limited mobility in terms of apprenticeship, and the fact that people cannot necessarily transfer along provinces, and that's something that Apoorv did tackle in his last answer. And I think that's it.
Thanks for all the important responses that we got. It's tough to end, but maybe, yeah. And I'll focus my response on Brian's first question, just highlighting Andre and all the work that he's done. But more seriously. That's the break conversation. We can tell others about that. I have small comments that I think might illustrate some of the hows of some of the things that some of my colleagues kind of brought up. Like most recently in terms of Madwa's perspectives about the apprenticeship aspects. We've heard about, and I think we've talked about in our report, like the development of a green seal type approach. We know that there's a red seal, a green seal for kind of supporting whether renewable energy or other energy related jobs could be an interesting interprovincial kind of mobility aspect that could draw on collective strengths across the provinces and kind of build on that pan-Canadian approach. The other thing that I want to say about the role of other stakeholders, I think we heard from the Honourable ex-clerk of the Privy Council that the involvement between the public and private sector needs to improve. And I think in our demonstrations of or illustrations of how Canadians can be leaders in the workforce, this must include the private sector. And so exploring innovative ways to have those inclusions, I think, are potentially not by forcing policies, but by encouraging kind of that social dimension of our energy future. And the final thing that I'd like to say is just, I think one of Brian's points was about whether the federal government made a mistake in kind of withdrawing from the responsibility of labor market information. I don't think we can say that it was a mistake. I think there are mechanisms now, coordination mechanisms that I think support more appropriately that balancing of local and regional perspectives with national coordination. And I think through forums like the labor market forums, through other strategies, we know that there's going to be a national energy strategy that potentially came out of the generation energy conversation, that these types of labor market questions need to transcend those provincial boundaries. So I think my final point would just be that when we're considering further climate policy, when we're considering further energy policy, let's remember this presentation about people and why jobs in this transition are important and need to be equally considered as others. And I think that was kind of an underlining message of everything that we tried to do. Good climate policy does consider jobs. Thank you.
Thank you, Task Force 2. So here again, we will skip the Q&A section. We do have lunch coming in about an hour, and I invite you all to stay through lunch and descend upon the Task Force members with your questions. So I'll now invite Task Force 3 to take the stage.
Can everyone hear me? Okay, perfect. So first we want to recognize that we're on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. My name is Nicole Weedman, and I'm based in Calgary. Furthest to my right is Ahmed Hanafi from Montreal. Next is Kelly O'Neill from Toronto. To my left is David Lawless from Ottawa, Sushma Narasetti from Toronto, and Graham Anderson of Vancouver. And our report is titled Change in Motion: How Canada Can Shape a Low-Carbon Future Through Electric, Autonomous, and Shared Transportation. So imagine it's 2050. Your usual commute to work took 15 minutes. Now it takes an hour. You look to your left, the public transit system is completely empty. There's autonomous cars everywhere. But sometimes there's only one person in it. Sometimes there's nobody in it. You know, and you're lucky to get to work this week. Last week, the road was flooded from extreme weather events from climate change. You finally get to work. You exit your car. It's smoggy and the air quality is poor. You walk into your office. You see all the power lines. And right when you're about to turn on your computer, there's a major blackout from all the increased use on the electrical grid. Is this the future that we want to live in? No, it's not. Our task force decided to research personal transportation. And specifically, we looked at 3 existing and accelerating disruptions: electric, autonomous, and shared vehicles. Now, the purpose of our work isn't to incentivize any of these disruptions. We're assuming that these disruptions are happening no matter what the adoption rates are. However, we have to recognize that these disruptions have very different potential impacts. So we need to make sure that the impacts, and those impacts can either reduce or increase greenhouse gas emissions. So we developed policy solutions to help steer these disruptions towards the most desirable impacts. Now, the reason why we picked transportation is because it accounts for 24% of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions. Approximately half of that 24% is due to personal transportation. This is a growing issue. There are more people driving. We're driving bigger, more inefficient vehicles. But we also have to recognize that this is a very complex issue. Transportation is more than just moving is more than just moving goods and people within cities. There are so many other factors that should be considered: safety, preference, cost, convenience. We decided to structure our report through this formula. And we have 3 factors here: fuel choice, vehicle efficiency, and user behavior. And all of these factors impact total greenhouse gas emissions. But we need to make sure that the disruptions positively impact the greenhouse gas emissions. So as an example, autonomous vehicles might have a positive impact on fuel choice or vehicle efficiency, but a negative impact on user behavior. So we need to make sure that no matter the disruption, the total greenhouse gas emissions are decreasing.
So before looking at policies that impact personal transportation, it's really important to better understand the personal mobility system. And our group found that there are 3 fundamental disruptions that are underway and accelerating. The first disruption is the advent of electric vehicles. Last year in Canada, electric vehicle sales increased by more than 60%, partly due to incentives and rebate programs offered by provinces such as Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia, but also due to the fact that buying an electric vehicle is much less expensive than an internal combustion car, especially over the lifetime of that vehicle. There are also impacts as electric vehicle adoption increases on the charging infrastructure required, such as EV charging across the country, to help alleviate the range anxiety and the fear that consumers have about electric vehicles, whether these fears are real or perceived. And then there's also the impact on the electricity grid as more and more people are charging and putting demands at different times of day. And so considering the different transmission and distribution of electricity is also important. The second disruption that we looked at was autonomous vehicles or self-driving vehicles. And they're already being tested on Canadian roads. But as a recent Senate report just announced or suggested, federal policy is still 15 years away. So it's already happening, and we need to do something about it, especially because this will change our personal mobility patterns in cities. As more affordable and convenient options of transportation become available, there's a risk that consumers will send their driver or self-driving car to run errands for them, or they'll choose to drive for longer distances, ultimately increasing the greenhouse gas emissions. Now, with this emerging technology, there's also a market that will be developed, not just for the vehicle themselves, but also to connect and integrate with existing public infrastructure. And the final disruption that we looked at was shared vehicles. Now, we're all familiar with, or probably familiar with the how Uber has transformed ride-hailing and taxis in our major cities, and this is likely to continue increasing in a world of electric and autonomous transportation. And it's also potentially going to change how we own vehicles and use vehicles, especially considering that major car manufacturers are considering changing their business model to one of ride-sharing and car-sharing. There's also the potential for higher vehicle utilization and the potential that shared vehicles will take away from public transit use. So these are all important considerations. Now, as we mentioned earlier, there are significant opportunities with these disruptions, but also significant risks. And without comprehensive, responsible public policy, the developments that I've just mentioned could lead to very undesirable impacts, such as zero passenger use, increase in congestion, as well as declining revenue generated through things like gasoline taxes. And so it's important that these negative impacts are improved by public policy so that we can get to a better future, one where ride sharing is integrated with public transit, and so that we're reducing congestion and that revenue generated is still maintained despite people maybe switching to electric vehicles. But whether we have a negative or positive future ultimately depends on the people within that system. And so to better understand human behavior and how people react in the personal mobility sector, we organized a community engagement event in which we developed a innovative simulation-style exercise. And this simulation was based on similar exercises such as Newtonian shift, which was developed by a Dutch utility, and the poverty simulation developed by the United Way. And what this allowed young Canadians between the ages of 18 to 35 was to take the role of actors within that system. And whether this was car manufacturers or consumers or provincial governments, and make decisions. And we were ultimately able to refine some of our initial policy ideas through this feedback. But it was also important because it helped we encouraged participants to empathize with actors. And as a public servant myself, I must say that it's particularly nice to discover a new way of engaging the public, especially considering we received very creative ideas from participants and created meaningful connections. So I would highly recommend that the government consider using more empathy-driven tools to engage the public going forward.
So we are thinking long term, that is 2050, and in order to have a meaningful impact, we need to act now. As we just heard, personal mobility systems are quite complex, and they require flexible and multifaceted policies to address the issues. So rather than propose a single policy that fulfills multiple roles, we are proposing a policy framework that comprises of 3 tiers: steer, accelerate, and protect, that would work together to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from personal transportation. Before we go into the details of these individual tiers and the policies under them, I want to make note of 2 points. First is that we are proposing a pan-Canadian framework that we envision being led by the federal government in partnership with the provinces, the territories, municipalities, and the indigenous governments. And the second point to note is that our proposed policies have an urban focus and context to them. We focused on the large urban centers, mainly because they are the most exposed to the rapid changes in the personal mobility systems. We do recognize that there could be a disproportionate impact on rural and indigenous communities, and as a result, unique policy recommendations and options are required, but they are beyond the scope of our research to address these equity concerns. So the first tier in the pan-Canadian framework is a set of policy recommendations that are aimed at steering consumer behavior to reduce or to make to select options to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. They're also geared towards maintaining sources of revenue for the government to ensure continued investment in infrastructure. As such, these policies are consumer-focused, and they have predetermined increasing trends over a period of time.
We recommend 3 policy levers that could be used to steer consumer behavior for better outcomes. Our first policy lever is dynamic mobility pricing in urban areas. Congestion, infrastructure, and pollution costs are all externalities that are rarely paid directly by drivers. Mobility pricing shapes transportation demand to the time and routes that are less congested, while also generating revenue that can be invested in improved infrastructure. This model has been adopted successfully in leading global cities such as Hong Kong, Stockholm, and London, and we believe it will only become more necessary with changes in personal mobility that we're discussing today. Our next suggested lever is time of use electricity pricing. With current electricity pricing across most of Canada, customers pay the same price regardless of what time they charge. However, the real cost and greenhouse gas impact of generation changes dramatically depending on peak and off-peak timing and the type of fuel used. Provinces across Canada could instead adopt an approach similar to that taken here in Ontario, where electricity pricing fluctuates at different times of day. This approach can achieve better greenhouse gas outcomes while avoiding new generation and transmission investments. The final lever we have suggested in this tier targets the federal excise tax on high-polluting vehicles. Currently, this tax applies only to very few luxury vehicles. We propose to increase and broaden this tax so that consumers are discouraged from buying the worst-performing vehicles based on greenhouse gas emissions, again, regardless of fuel choice. New revenue would then be available to fund infrastructure investments or to provide incentives for low emissions vehicles.
And the second tier in our policy framework is a set of policy recommendations aimed at supporting investments in innovation, mainly to provide consumers with more options to more rapidly reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. In addition, these investments would also be done in infrastructure to, for example, roll out charging infrastructure. And as such, these policies are more business focused, and they promote a collaboration and a joint investment between the public and the private sectors.
Again, we recommend 3 policy levers to accelerate supporting investments. First, we recommend continuous improvement in fleet vehicle efficiency standards. Our current fleet efficiency standards are harmonized with the United States, with targets that gradually increase every year. As the US now plans to weaken their standards, Canada must continue strengthening ours to ensure that fleet-wide efficiency improvements improves consistently regardless of fuel choice. This policy has also been identified as one of the most cost-effective and politically acceptable options for supporting electric vehicle uptake, as it creates a direct benefit for automakers that sell increasing numbers of electric and low emissions vehicles. Our next recommended policy lever is the Clean Fuel Standard, and this type of policy has been in place in British Columbia since 2010. The federal government currently seeks to scale this policy across the country. This policy supports a transition to clean fuels while ensuring that all existing fuels reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by a reasonable amount each year. These reductions can be achieved by increasingly blending lower carbon biofuels into our fuel mix. And for the final lever in this tier, we support investment in innovative electric vehicle charging infrastructure by the Canada Infrastructure Bank and other government sources. This was one of the findings that was specifically supported by our public engagement activity, where participants playing the role of automakers and ride-hailing companies successfully leveraged a similar policy to develop new charging stations.
The third tier in our policy framework is a set of recommendations aimed at protecting against undesirable consequences from emerging technologies such as autonomous vehicles. We heard earlier how if the autonomous vehicles and the deployment is not managed well, it could potentially lead to an increase in greenhouse gas emissions. So these set of policies protect against those undesirable consequences. These policies are more stringent. However, they are less likely to be triggered in the near term.
Here, we suggest a proactive approach to regulating autonomous vehicles, given the particular risk of increased low or zero occupancy travel with these vehicles. Fundamentally, we believe that those operating autonomous vehicles or vehicle fleets will require clear operating standards, and that there are benefits to aligning these standards across jurisdictions as much as possible. And finally, we suggest that higher occupancy autonomous vehicle use should be encouraged by specifically targeting autonomous vehicle fleet operators and owners with clear incentives. We suggest that a system of additional levies for low or zero occupancy use, or tradable credits permitting a limited amount of lower occupancy time, could be 2 effective options for achieving this goal.
At the beginning, I painted a fairly dark picture of what our future could look like. But our future could look like this. As you can see, there's higher occupancy vehicles with less congestion, a continued investment in infrastructure, and most importantly, as it relates to our paper, lower greenhouse gas emissions from personal transportation. This possible future is within our reach. We now welcome feedback and questions. And to preemptively respond to any questions, Carol was the best mentor. We're very, very fortunate to have her. Thank you.
Thank you, Task Force 3. I invite the panelists to respond to the presentation.
Thank you. Same thing, I have a mix of questions and observations. One observation is it seems to me it's common to all three groups that you've struggled with the question of forecasting. I don't know if it's a sign of the times. Would the same thing have happened if we'd done this exercise 10 years ago? I don't know, but it's quite interesting. And I found that all of you were pretty realistic about the capacity to forecast adequately, and therefore we have to find ways of approximating forecasts as opposed to thinking that we can forecast with some precision. My other observation is that I thought you did a good job of pointing out the negative consequences of desirable developments. Can be annoying at times, but it's better to do that than not to imagine what negative consequences would be. On you described your work as a policy framework. I have to say that it's a fairly developed policy framework, and you have frameworks within frameworks, which is a good thing. I'm a big fan of frameworks. I want to ask a couple of questions. One is back to my point about forecasting. I think you start out by saying that you tried to imagine what things would be like in 2050 and how we get there. So why 2050? What is there something about this particular sector kind of activity that suggests that I was trying to do the math here, 32 years is the right framework, the right time frame? Should it be shorter? Should it be longer? Why pick that? And having an answer to that might be one of the ways of thinking about what the various forecasting methods might be. Secondly, and it's basically my only other question, I think, is you focused on what you call individual transport. I'm in the transport business these days with the bridge between the two auto sectors of regions of Canada and the U.S. And I'm not become very expert on this, but I know that the people in that business care an awful lot about the future of trucks in connection with automation and self-driven vehicles. So I was wondering why, how do you get people to focus on cars where there's a huge amount of attention focused on trucks, because the economic interests tend to be there rather than cars? And secondly, because, as I understand it, from a greenhouse gas emissions problematic, trucks matter a lot, especially if they idle on old bridges. That's it.
I liked your presentation. I was puzzled as to why it was limited to only 4 people. I don't know what the two of you, if you did. Oh, good for you. Just very useful to know. I liked your presentation because it set out early the scope of what you were going to focus on. You described the approach you were going to take in terms of levers. But more importantly, you had one integrative policy approach, which can be best described as user pay. That throughout the 3 major levers, there is a connecting line. Let it be the electricity pricing, let it be the investment via the Canada Infrastructure Bank that can only invest if you make money, therefore toll roads. The higher occupancy lanes, if you wish, all revolve around the principle of user pay. That the standards for the more polluting vehicles, which I commend to you because it becomes a focus around which all of the other specific initiatives can be looked at. So if you pitch it to a government, to a minister, you start off with, do you accept, yes or no, the principle, the policy of user pay? If so, you can then cascade down. So I thought that was well structured. In regards to implementation, I'll give you a 30-second point of comparison. When I was Deputy of Environment in Ontario in mid-90s, the government wanted to move away from the 2-liter bottle of Coke, Pepsi, and have the bottling companies make the glass bottles because it was better for the environment. Passed the regulation, can't have the two. You can only have X percent, and you have 25% big glass bottles. I focus group tested this with my mother. She said, absolutely not, because they break, they're too heavy, I'm not going to buy it. It appeared that the rest of the marketplace responded the same way. Social engineering is not easy, to make people do what they don't want to do. Messing with their cars is akin to taking a horse away from a cowboy 150 years ago, out west. So my question is, how does one implement changes you're talking about using the user pay, but how do you get beyond just user pay? Because social engineering, convincing people to change their habits is not easy. So did you, in your discussions, give thought to how one goes about mobilizing, changing? Because government, nanny state, in the year 2040, 50, ain't going to be that strong. Thank you. I borrowed some of Brian's time that he took from me the other time.
We'll call it even.
Okay.
In my single question, I'm going to invite you to make what I think is implicit in your paper, which is very good, very well thought through, very well presented, to see if what I think is implicit is, invite you to make it explicit. So you make a big point here that I don't think the auto industry would welcome, which is that a transition to more AVs as the principal, or if you will, sole principal form of public transportation will lead to more greenhouse gas, and it's not where we want to go. That's essentially what you are saying. So is it not then the case that what you are suggesting, and that can be the only way that we would get at the last image that you put up, is that most people living in high-density communities would not own cars? That the only way you're going to get to that photo is if that's true. And if that is true, especially given the point Richard just made, which is we are asking cowboys to give up their horses, then you must provide them with an alternative. And in a high-density community, that can only be, is it not true, convenient and affordable mass public transportation. And just to push you a little bit farther, because you are directing these comments to the federal government, are you arguing that, as is the case in most of the developed world, for example, China and the European Union, that building public transportation is a national mandate, and it's something that should be, because in the alternate, you are dumping this issue on other jurisdictions. The federal government is moving on the way you're proposing and then leaving it to somebody else to provide the alternative of public transportation. And so then are you essentially proposing to use road and occupancy pricing and AV infrastructure to be complementary to that, but with the public policy purpose of saying most people should not own these? Is that what you're saying?
So I believe there's two people who will respond on behalf of the entire group in this case. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you all for your questions, and thank you, Carol, although you didn't ask today for all of your questions over the past 10 months that really helped define our thinking and get us to where we are today. As Nicole mentioned, Carol's a fantastic mentor. We're very lucky to have her. So starting, I guess, on Brian, your point, and a little bit to the taking a horse away from a cowboy point as well, this actually is a very interesting time in personal transportation because the movement away from personal ownership is already starting to happen. You see most of the major auto manufacturers looking at how they're going to move to more of a fleet approach rather than selling cars to individuals, because that's where they see the market going with things like Uber, Google already trying to make that the market. The GMs and Fords and Mercedes of the world all have to think, okay, how do we respond to that? And so they're preemptively starting to essentially try and take cars out of individuals' hands and figure out how they make money by owning them themselves and renting it out. What we're looking at then is how do you ensure that in that new world, you're not having people sending a Ford car for their groceries without even being in it. They're sharing it with other people going to work at the same time as them, their higher occupancy. But, very large but there, is that that does not ensure equity in access to transportation. And so absolutely, public transit needs to be a part of the overall framework. And one of the reasons we did look at policies that had revenue neutral or hopefully revenue generating impacts was because we know there will need to be additional investment in public infrastructure like that. And then just quickly on Andre's question in terms of the focus on trucks, part of the reason that we decided to focus on personal transportation was because we know companies are already looking at trucks. That's going to probably happen through market forces. It doesn't need the same amount of government intervention as personal transportation does. That's sort of how we got to our focus. We are hoping that the trucking industry and maybe even aviation industry, there's more talk about electric airplanes, I'll believe when I see it, is that as they can reduce their costs, they will. And so as electric vehicles come down in price, that will start to happen automatically.
So I'll start with Andre's question about the forecasts. If you Google EV forecast sales for the next 50 years, there are tons of resources. They completely diverge. There's a lot of different methodologies being used and a lot of different ways of forecasting EV adoption. We've decided to treat it as an exogenous factor. So the way we see our policy framework or our pan-Canadian policy framework, to take into account your comment, is that it's a proactive approach to handle those undesirable consequences and sort of optimize or maximize our benefit from those disruptions that are happening on the EV, autonomous, and shared front. So we see that it's sort of technology agnostic. If EVs hit 20% and another technology comes up and has a higher market share, we see that our policy framework does remain still relevant, regardless of where we are in that deployment of electric vehicles and other technologies. On the point of user pay that Richard brought up, I'll actually reverse your question. So your second question was about implementation and that user behavior is pretty hard to social engineer and alter, and that's a very good point. But as one of the slides that we had earlier pointed, user behavior is one of those key pillars to attack GHG emissions. So the way we see user pay is that it's one of those mechanisms that you can attack user behavior, right? So you can do informational campaigns, you can do more awareness campaigns, and sort of other policy instruments. But we see user pay as one of the most influential policies at that. So for example, if I know that if I charge my car at noon, it's going to cost me twice what it costs if I charge it overnight, I'm going to obviously charge it overnight. So there are those sort of user behavior elements engraved in our user pay policies, and that's how we plan on implementing them. And I think that's all. Oh, actually, one more question about the messing with cars and how that's dangerous. That also comes back to what we said about personal mobility is a very complex issue. It's a very emotional issue. It's not just how much it's going to cost me, but it's how much it's going to cost me. Do I feel comfortable? Do I feel safe? And it's definitely an issue that's, again, very hard to social engineer, but we think some of our policies could attack that element and hopefully move the needle in the right direction.
And I'd actually just add on the social engineering point. I did do some work on this topic at Mars last year, looking more at the social change side of changing user behavior. And one thing that was very clear from that research is that government may not be the right venue for social engineering beyond taxes and fees that sort of help backstop and move people in the right direction. That might be where you need to bring in, nonprofits and the private sector who have more expertise in changing people's behaviors in different ways.
Thank you. We have time for a question. Would anyone like to ask a question? There are 2 microphones on the floor. Okay. So I totally get that last question is between you and lunch. Thank you, Task Force 3. I invite Adam Goldenberg, Chair of the Board of Directors of Action Canada, to come and offer some closing remarks.
Merci Rhonda et merci tout le monde d'être avec nous aujourd'hui. C'est un grand plaisir pour moi en tant que président du conseil d'administration d'Action Canada de vous accueillir à notre communauté et en particulier d'accueillir les participants dans le programme Votre Avenir énergétique comme Fellows d'Action Canada. This has been a remarkable morning for us as an organization. Action Canada has been around since 2003, selecting emerging leaders who have demonstrated leadership capacity and extraordinary leadership potential, and giving them an experience of their country and of their fellow emerging leaders that would be transformative for them, and we hope in the long term for all of us as Canadians. And to be able to continue that work in partnership with the Public Policy Forum this year has been a truly joyous experience for us. And I say on behalf of our board and on behalf of all 184, soon to be an even 200 Action Canada Fellows, thank you for all of your hard work, for your magnificent presentations today, and congratulations on the conclusion of an extraordinary journey. So congratulations again. A few words of thanks, first of all, to the sponsors of this program this year, the Government of Canada, the Lawson Foundation, McCarthy Tétrault, where I work from 9 to 5, sometimes a little longer, to WestJet, and to, who am I forgetting? I'm sorry? EY, of course, a good client of McCarthy Tétrault, who I should not forget at a time like this, as well as to the various partners of the program all across the country who've made this year possible. Thank you for your support. I want to give a special recognition to the leadership of Ed Greenspan at the Public Policy Forum. Ed, I know he really regretted not being able to be here today, because he asked at least 3 of us to tell you that he really regretted not being able to be here today, and I was one of those people. But Ed and his vision for this program actually precedes the conversation with Action Canada about working together. And if it were not for Ed's vision of bringing younger, emerging voices into the public policy conversation in Canada through a program like this, we would not have this partnership, and you, Yeffers, would not have had the last number of months. And in particular to Catherine and to Rhonda especially for making this year such a success. I have seen firsthand how hard Rhonda and her team have worked to organize each of the working conferences, including this one, and the results speak for themselves. So congratulations to you, Rhonda, on a fantastic job well done. And my final point is that this relationship between Action Canada and the Public Policy Forum is only just beginning. Very pleased to share that we will be doing this again next year. The Public Policy Forum will be running the Action Canada National Fellowship Program in 2018 and 2019. And so if you in the room or watching on the web know of anyone who should be able to do or wants to be able to do what the Yeffers just did, please encourage them to apply before March 31st. You'll find the details on the Public Policy Forum website as well as the Action Canada website. So please enjoy your lunch. Thank you again for being here, and congratulations once again.